She had buried her husband in October when the ground was still soft enough to receive him. Now it was November and the ground had gone to iron, and she was beginning to wonder if the earth had taken everything it intended to take. Mei Harlow stood at the edge of the eastern pasture with her fingers locked around a fence post and the wind cutting through her coat like it was made of paper. The northern sky had gone the color of a bruise. 3 days. That was what remained before the bank sent their final notice, a letter she already knew by heart, had turned over so many times in her sleepless nights that the words had worn grooves into her mind. 3 days before December. 3 days before Iron Creek Valley swallowed the last of what James had built with his hands and his stubborn, beautiful belief that love could hold a piece of wild country together. She pulled the collar of his coat tighter around her throat. It still smelled faintly of him. Wool and pine resin, and the particular cold of early mornings when he used to rise before her and have the stove going by the time she came downstairs. 2 years. 2 years and the coat still carried him, and standing in his smell in the dying light of the afternoon was both the cruelest comfort she had ever known. The cattle were restless. She could hear them lowing from the near pasture, disturbed by whatever the wind was carrying down from the Rockies. 17 fence posts leaned at angles along the eastern stretch, threatening to go over before spring. The barn roof sagged on the western side where she'd patched it 3 times with canvas and prayer. The well pump had frozen twice already this season, and the chickens were laying less than half of what they'd managed in September. She was 31 years old. She had crossed an ocean from Guangzhou to San Francisco. As a girl of 16, survived the slow, bewildering grief of her mother's death, met a lanky Wyoming rancher at a market stall where he'd been buying dried herbs he didn't know the names of, and followed him north into the high country because he'd looked at her like she was a question he'd spent his whole life trying to answer. James Harlow had given her a home. Then a fever had taken him in April, and the home had become a sentence. She let go of the fence post and turned back toward the house. The snow had started in earnest now, fat flakes that would accumulate overnight into something serious. She needed to bank the fire check. The water troughs moved the 3 heifers closer to the barn. The list was endless and familiar. Each task a small war against entropy, and she was so tired of fighting alone that some mornings the most defiant thing she could do was simply get out of bed. She had made it halfway across the yard when she heard a horse coming fast across the frozen field. "Mrs. Harlow," the voice was high and urgent. She turned to find Tommy Briggs, the 12-year-old son of her nearest neighbors, riding hard toward her on a brown gelding that was blowing steam into the cold air. The boy's face was flushed with cold and something else, the particular brightness of a child carrying news too important to wait. She caught the horse's bridle as Huey pulled up. "Tommy, slow down. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, ma'am." He said it like a boy who wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Well, not wrong exactly. Pa wanted me to come tell you. There's a rider coming up the valley road. Big man on a gray horse. Pa didn't recognize him, but he's headed this way direct." He paused, catching his breath. "Ma wanted you to know, being alone out here and all." May felt something tighten in her spine. Old instinct, the same one that had kept her alive through 2 Wyoming winters without anyone to watch her back. "Your father couldn't tell anything about him. Only that he's not from around here, but he's riding like a man who knows where he's going." Tommy shifted in the saddle. "Pa said to say he'd come himself if you needed. Tell your father I appreciate it." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small cloth bundle, dried lavender and mint, from what remained of her summer garden, carefully portioned. "Give this to your mother, for her cough. The mint will help more than the medicine doc sent." Tommy pocketed the bundle with the careful reverence of a child who understood winter scarcity. He turned his horse and rode back toward the Briggs' spread, and May watched him go, then stood alone in the falling snow for a long moment before she walked to the house. She took the rifle from above the door. It was old, the stock worn smooth by James's hands, the barrel scratched from years of hard use, but it was loaded, and she knew how to use it. A woman alone in Iron Creek Valley learned such things quickly, or she didn't stay alone for long. One way or another. The rider appeared 30 minutes later, materializing out of the white-gray afternoon like something the storm had conjured. He sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy canvas coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. The gray horse moved with the measured steadiness of an animal that had covered serious distance. No wasted motion, no nervousness, just the patient, ground-eating gait of a working horse that understood its job. May stood on the porch with the rifle held loose at her side, not raised but visible, and waited. He reined up 20 feet from the porch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She studied him in the failing light, the weathered face beneath the hat brim, the deep lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind, the capable stillness of a man who was comfortable with silence. He was older than she'd first guessed. 40 maybe, with the lean and careful hardness of someone who had earned his survival the hard way. Mrs. Harlow. His voice was low, roughened by cold or disuse. That's right. She didn't raise the rifle, but she didn't move her hand away from the trigger guard either. State your business. My name is Ethan Cross. He made no move to dismount, which she appreciated. Daniel Harlow sent me. The name hit her like cold water. Daniel James' younger brother, safe in San Francisco with his freight business, and his formal letters and his condolences that had never once materialized into a visit. She felt something complicated move through her chest, hope and resentment braided together in a way she couldn't quite separate. Daniel sent you. She kept her voice flat. He got word about the ranch, about how things stand. Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, and she caught, just barely, the wince of a man who had been riding too long in the cold. He asked me to come help, work in exchange for shelter through the winter. No wages. I'm not asking for charity, ma'am. I'm asking for work. I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to. I can offer shelter and meals, nothing more. That's all I'm asking for. The snow fell between them, soft and relentless. May looked at the darkening sky, then back at the stranger on the gray horse. Every instinct, she had said, caution. She knew nothing about this man except a name and a claimed connection to her dead husband's brother, and the history of this country was full of women who'd made the mistake of opening their doors to strangers out of desperation. But the storm was coming in hard, and the cattle needed moving before full dark, and the barn roof needed attention before the next real accumulation. And turning away help because of pride was the kind of foolishness that killed people in Iron Creek Valley. Barn's there. She gestured with the rifle barrel toward the structure. Stall on the left is empty. Get your horse settled and come to the house. I'll have coffee ready. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, a single unhurried gesture, and rode toward the barn without another word. May went inside and lowered the rifle and stood for a long moment with her hands pressed flat against the kitchen table, steadying herself. Then she built up the fire and put the coffee on and watched through the frost-edged window as the stranger moved through her barn with the efficiency of a man who understood horses. He took his time with the gray, checking the animal's feet, rubbing it down properly, before seeing to his own comfort. It was the kind of care James used to take. The thought of James sent the familiar ache through her chest, as it always did, arriving without announcement and settling in like weather. She had met him in San Francisco on a Tuesday morning in April, when she was 23, and working in her uncle's herb shop on Clay Street. He'd come in looking for something for his horse's winter cough, had described the symptoms in careful, earnest detail, while she fought the urge to smile at his thoroughness. He'd come back the next day and the day after that, and on the fourth day, he'd admitted the horse was fine, and he just wanted an excuse to talk to her. She'd given him a bundle of dried chamomile and told him if he wanted to talk, he could buy her tea first. They were married 6 months later. She was in Wyoming before the year was out, learning the rhythms of a country that had no patience for sentiment or hesitation, only work and more work, and the occasional grace of a clear winter sky so vast it made you feel like the smallest and most fortunate thing alive. That was 8 years ago. Now James was buried behind the barn, and the ranch was failing, and a stranger was putting his horse away in her stall, and the snow was coming down so thick she could barely see the fence line. Ethan Cross appeared at the kitchen door 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots on the porch before entering. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed in the dying afternoon light, the silver threading through his dark hair, the old scar along his jaw, the particular quality of stillness in his face that she associated with men who had spent more time alone than in company. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. "Cups on the shelf." He poured without being told where to stand, wrapping both hands around the cup and positioning himself near the stove without presuming to sit. The quiet between them stretched, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. "How do you know Daniel?" she asked finally. "Worked for him 5 years back when he was running freight between the mining camps." Ethan took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes steady above the rim. He's the one who taught me to read ledgers. When I wrote to him asking if he knew of winter work, he mentioned you might need help. He didn't write to tell me you were coming. Probably figured you'd say no. The corner of Ethan's mouth moved slightly. He knows you're stubborn. He doesn't know me at all. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. He never came to the funeral. Never once made the ride north to see if his brother's widow needed anything. Now he sends a stranger. Ethan looked at her steadily over his coffee cup. You're right. He should have come himself. He didn't, and I'm here. A pause. The question is whether you're going to let pride get between you and the help you need. The directness of it stole her breath. In 2 years of widowhood, she had received an ocean of condolences, an endless parade of sympathetic looks, and careful kindnesses and useless encouragements to let time do its work. No one had spoken to her like this, blunt and honest and free of performance. I won't be a charity case, she said quietly. Then don't be one. Work me hard and I'll earn my keep. He set down the cup. But don't turn away help because you're too proud to need it. Mei looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness in his dark eyes, the complete absence of condescension or pity. Then she turned toward the small room off the kitchen. Room's off the kitchen here. It's small, but it's warm. You can sleep there. Barn's fine. Storm's going to be 20 below by midnight. She didn't look at him. Room's been empty anyway. A pause. I appreciate it, Mrs. Harlow. Mei, if you're going to be here all winter, you might as well use my name. Mei. He said it carefully, the single syllable respectful. And I'm Ethan. They drank their coffee in silence while the storm moved in from the north and the cattle called from the pasture, anxious and low, and the last gray light faded from the windows. Cattle in the south pasture need moving, Ethan said, looking out at the darkness. The fence there won't hold if the drifts get deep. She felt surprise flicker through her. You checked the pasture, rode the property line before I came to the house. He looked at her steadily, wanted to see what I was getting into. A beat. The barn needs proper patching before the real cold hits. The well pump's going to freeze again if it's not banked with straw, and the chicken coop's watering trough has a crack along the base. I know about all of it. Heat rose in her cheeks despite herself. There's only so much one person can. That's why I'm here. No judgment in his voice. Only statement of fact. Where do you want me to start? For a moment, she just looked at him, this quiet, weathered stranger who had walked into her failing ranch and begun immediately trying to understand what it needed. Pride and pragmatism fought in her chest. Pride had kept her alive this long, but pragmatism told her that pride alone couldn't move cattle in a blizzard. Cattle first, she said. If we lose them, we lose everything. I'll head out now. I'm coming with you. He studied her for a beat. Then he nodded once. Fair enough. They went out into the storm together, the wind hitting them like a wall the moment they cleared the porch. Mei pulled her hat down and wrapped the red scarf, the one her mother had sent from San Francisco, before she died vivid against all that white around her face, and followed Ethan toward the barn. Inside, the animals shifted in their stalls. Ethan saddled the gray with clean, efficient movements, while Mei readied her own horse, a tough little Mustang mare she'd named Pepper, for the constellation of white flecks across her nose. The mare was steady and fearless, built for exactly this kind of work, and she stood calm while Mei cinched the saddle despite the howling wind outside. The ride to the south pasture took 20 minutes that felt like 2 hours. The wind drove the snow horizontal, turning the world into a white void with no horizon and no depth. And Mei navigated by memory alone, by the way the ground dropped slightly toward the creek crossing, by the particular lean of the cottonwood she'd long since stopped needing to see to know was there. The cattle were bunched against the fence line, 7 head of beef stock that represented the beating heart of Mei's financial survival. They were agitated, rolling their eyes and crowding each other in the way of animals that understood danger was incoming and couldn't figure out which way to run from it. Ethan circled wide and came around the far side, moving the herd with a patience and skill that told her immediately he had done this before many times in many different kinds of weather. He didn't rush them, didn't crowd, just applied steady, even pressure until the cattle understood they were being guided rather than chased. Mei took the opposite flank, and together they turned the herd north, pushing them through drifts that were already knee-deep on the horses. It was brutal, exhausting, disorienting work. The wind screamed and the snow obliterated everything beyond 10 feet, and twice the cattle broke and tried to turn back toward the fence line, and she had to wheel Pepper around and push them back. But Ethan never faltered, Marvin, never showed frustration, just kept up that patient, steady pressure, and eventually the cattle yielded and began to move in the right direction. By the time they had the herd settled in the near pasture, full dark had fallen and the storm had become something alive and malicious, clawing at anything that dared stay outside. May's face was numb. Her hands, even inside their heavy gloves, were cramped with cold. Her whole body ached with the particular exhaustion of hours of hard physical work in conditions that wanted to kill her. But the cattle were safe. In the barn, they unsaddled the horses in silence and rubbed them down, and May noticed in the odd intimacy of working beside someone in a small, warm space that their hands fell into the same rhythm without discussion. He'd brush, she'd check the cinch. She'd pour water, he'd fork hay. Like they'd done this before in some previous life, or like it was simply the natural language of two people who understood work. When they finally stumbled back to the house, May heated the soup she'd had going on the back of the stove, potatoes and onions, and the last of the carrots from the root cellar, simple and filling, and they ate without conversation. Too tired for words. The fire crackled. The storm howled. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a shutter came loose and banged rhythmically against the house wall, and neither of them had the energy to do anything about it. After dinner, May showed Ethan to the small room off the kitchen. It had been James's study once before the illness moved him upstairs. Now it held only a narrow bed, a ladder-backed chair, and a small table with a stub of candle in a tin holder. Sparse and cold, but the stovepipe from the kitchen ran through the wall and would keep the worst of the chill away. "Thank you," Ethan said, standing in the doorway with the candle in his hand. The light caught the planes of his face and made him look older and younger, at the same time the weathering of hard years and something beneath it that was simpler and less armored. "For the room, for letting me help." May nodded, not trusting herself to say anything past the unexpected tightening in her throat. She retreated to her own room upstairs and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the storm and to the faint, unfamiliar sounds of another person settling in below. Another heartbeat in the silence. She should have felt disturbed by it. She had been alone for 2 years, and alone had become her natural state, defended, watchful, self-contained. A stranger in her house should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, what she felt was something she hadn't had words for in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It felt like a held breath finally released. The storm buried Iron Creek Valley under 2 feet of snow by morning. May woke to watery gray light and the smell of coffee rising from the kitchen below, and for one disoriented moment she thought she was 25 years old, and James was downstairs making breakfast, and everything was as it should be. Then memory settled back into place, and she dressed quickly and went down to find Ethan standing at the kitchen window with a cup in his hand, looking out at the transformed landscape. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She poured herself a cup and stood beside him at the window. Outside, the world was white and absolute, every fence post crowned with snow, every building softened and rounded under the accumulation, the sky pale as paper above it all. "Barn roof," Ethan said, studying the structure across the yard. "I can patch the worst sections today if the temperature holds. Need to get it done before the next storm." "I'll help," he glanced at her. "It's cold work, icy up there." "I know the ranch, Ethan." She kept her voice even. "I know the roof. I've been up there 3 times this season already." A slow, slightly surprised smile crossed his weathered face. "Didn't figure you hadn't." He turned back to the window. "Just didn't want you to think I expected it." They worked through the morning, Ethan stripping the worst rotted sections, while May passed up replacement boards and nails and hammered patches into place from the other end. The work required concentration and a certain trust. The shingles were treacherous under their coating of frozen snow, and there were 2 moments when she felt her boots slip and found Ethan's hand there already reaching steady and unhurried as if he'd been watching for it. By noon, they'd reinforced the critical sections. They climbed down stiff and cold and satisfied and stood together in the snow looking up at what they'd done. "It'll hold through the next one," Ethan said. "It'll have to." May flexed her sore hands inside her gloves. "We don't have the lumber for a full replacement until spring." He nodded, and they walked back to the house for more coffee, and somewhere in the simple warmth of that moment, the accomplished work, the shared cold, the small domestic comfort of coming inside together, May felt the first hesitant loosening of something she had kept locked for 2 years. The pattern that established itself over the following days was built from work the same way everything in Iron Creek Valley was built. They rose before dawn and moved through the ranch's needs together, fences, troughs, feed the 100 small maintenance tasks that winter never stopped generating. Ethan proved himself capable of everything and asked for nothing beyond what he'd requested at the outset. He was quiet in the particular way of men who thought before they spoke, and he listened with the full attention of someone who understood that other people's expertise mattered. He never presumed. That was the thing May noticed first. He never suggested a different way of doing things without framing it as a question. Never made decisions about her ranch without her. When she said east pasture, they went east. When she said the well pump needed the south cover, he asked how she'd done it before and followed her lead. In the evenings, they ate together in tired, companionable silence, or talked in the careful way of people who were still learning the edges of each other's history. She learned that he had grown up in Montana with a father who traveled between homesteads doing repairs, a man who could fix anything broken, and had passed that skill to his son. That his father had died when Ethan was 16, a horse's kick instantaneous, and that after that he'd simply kept moving because staying in one place without him seemed impossible. 25 years of moving, of arriving and working and leaving before the place could become something he'd have to grieve. "Why did Daniel send you specifically?" she asked one evening, a week after his arrival. They were in the barn checking on a heifer that had gone slightly lame on the frozen ground. The warm animal smell kept the worst cold away, and the lantern made a small golden island in the dark. Of all the people he knows. Ethan was silent for a moment, examining the heifer's hoof with gentle, thorough hands. He didn't exactly. She looked at him. "What? He mentioned you might need help. That was real." He set the heifer's foot down and straightened slowly. "But it wasn't quite, he didn't send me the way you'd send a package." A pause, something careful in his expression. "I asked him if he had work or knew of any. He told me about the ranch, about what you were up against. I asked for the details. I made the choice to come." "Why?" The lantern light caught the lines of his face. "Because it sounded like a place worth helping." She held his gaze for a long moment in the warm amber dark and then looked away first. "The heifer's got a stone bruise. Painful but not permanent. Keep her off the ice for 3 days." "Yes, ma'am." They walked back to the house through snow that crunched underfoot like broken glass, the stars burning cold and brilliant in a sky so clear it seemed polished. At the door, May paused with her hand on the latch. "Thank you, Ethan." She didn't look at him. "For being honest about it." He was quiet for a moment. "First honest thing I've told you. Won't be the last." She went inside and felt his presence behind her like warmth, solid and deliberate, and told herself it meant nothing beyond the basic animal comfort of not being alone. The second storm came 3 days later, fiercer than the first howling out of the north, with a ferocity that made the first week's weather seem apologetic. It came in the night, announced by a drop in temperature so sharp and sudden that May woke from sleep with the instinctive alarm of someone who had learned to read weather the way other people read faces. By morning, the world outside the windows had been reduced to white noise snow, driving horizontal visibility down to nothing, the wind producing a sound like something alive and in pain as it worked at the corners of the house. For 2 days, they were effectively trapped. They made the necessary runs to the barn twice daily, fighting through drifts that came to their waists in places to feed the animals and break ice in the water troughs. It was brutal, disorienting work, even in the short distances between house and barn, and both times May found herself instinctively keeping close to Ethan's dark form in the whiteout, using him as a landmark in a world that had lost all reference. The enforced intimacy of those 2 days changed something between them, in the way that shared extremity always does. They talked more there in the firelight while the storm raged outside. Not about the ranch, not about the work, about themselves. She told him about Guangzhou, about the smell of the harbor and her grandmother's kitchen, and the particular quality of light in the Pearl River Delta at dusk, a light she had never found again anywhere in America. About the ship crossing the weeks of gray Atlantic water that seemed to go on longer than the world was wide. About arriving in San Francisco at 16, speaking no English, living above her uncle's shop, learning the city the way you learn any foreign language, through humiliation and stubbornness, and small, hard-won victories. He told her about Montana, about growing up in the saddle following his father from ranch to ranch across the high country, learning that everywhere was temporary and home was a concept for people who could afford permanence, about the particular loneliness of 35 years of arriving and leaving. "Don't you want something that's yours?" she asked. The fire had burned low and the storm was making its inhuman sound against the windows, and they were sitting on opposite ends of the kitchen bench with a half-finished hand of cards between them. "Somewhere that doesn't ask you to leave at the end of the season." Ethan looked at the cards for a long moment. "I've thought about what that would look like," he said. "I'm not sure I'd know what to do with it if I found it." "You'd work for it," May said. "Same as everything else." His eyes met hers across the table, and she saw something in them that she hadn't expected, something unguarded and almost pained, the look of a person touching an old wound with unexpected gentleness. Then the wind hit the house with a sudden vicious gust, rattling every window in the structure, and he stood and said he should check on the livestock. She listened to the door close behind him and sat alone with the dying fire, her heart beating in a way she didn't examine too closely. He came back 10 minutes later, snow-dusted and cold-cheeked, and reported the barn was holding, and they went to their separate rooms without speaking of what had passed in the silence between them. But it was there, real and warming like embers under ash. When the storm broke on the third day, they emerged into a world remade. Snow stretched to every horizon in unbroken white. The drifts had reached the eaves of the barn on the north side, and the gate to the south pasture had been buried entirely. It took 2 full days to dig out, shoveling paths, breaking ice, hauling feet through the kind of snow that grabs your legs and doesn't let go. Hard, bone-deep, necessary work. But they did it together, and with each hour of shared effort, each moment of wordless coordination, each time she looked up and found him already moving to the place he was needed, the wall between them grew a fraction thinner. She was not ready to name what was happening. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready. But she could feel it steady as the compass needle she kept on the windowsill, a small brass instrument James had brought her from Denver the first winter, telling her that a person always needed to know which way was north. The compass needle pointed true, and so did something else she had almost stopped believing in. The bills came on a Thursday, slipped under the door by Frederick Hollis from the First Territorial Bank, who hadn't even had the decency to knock. May stood at the kitchen table and looked at the figure at the bottom of the payment notice and felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. $300 by end of January. In her current condition, it might as well have been $3,000. Hollis came by, she told Ethan that evening. She put the notice on the table between them. Let him read it. He read it twice, his face carefully neutral. Then he set it down and said, "How much time? 6 weeks, maybe 7. She pulled the notice back toward her and folded it with the particular care of a person handling something dangerous. "I've been selling off cattle as I can. I've got $240 set aside. The rest I can't see a way to." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then the North Woods, past the creek. He looked at her. "I rode that section of the property line last week. There are stands of pine up there, good straight timber, 2 or 3 acres worth. Did you know about them?" May stared at him. James never mentioned. He might not have known what they were worth, but I've done timber work and I know what I was looking at. He leaned forward slightly. The railroad construction camp is 20 miles north. They buy timber, constantly ties building materials. That pine would fetch good money. She felt hope move through her chest, fragile and dangerous, the way hope always felt in winter, like a match flame in the wind. "You'd have to cut it, haul it. We'd have to." "Ethan," she looked at him across the table. "Why would you do that? Work yourself half to death for a ranch that isn't yours, a debt that isn't yours." "Because this place matters." He said it simply, without ornamentation. "What you're fighting for, it matters. And I'm tired of drifting through places that don't." The words sat between them in the silence of the kitchen, weighted with more than their face value. May held his gaze for a moment that stretched until it became something more than comfortable, and then something more than that. "We start tomorrow," she said finally. "At first light." He nodded once. "At first light," he agreed. That night she lay awake in the darkness with the compass in her hand, its needle pointing north forward, always forward, and let herself feel just for a moment the particular quality of a future that had not entirely foreclosed. The timber was real. The debt was real. The man sleeping in the room below her was real. She set the compass on the bedside table and lay back and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The storm had passed, but the cold hadn't. She could hear it working at the house, the creak and groan of old wood contracting against the temperature, the whisper of residual wind finding the gaps in the caulking. Sounds she knew intimately now, as familiar as breathing. This house had become part of her, the way the ranch had become part of her through accumulated hours and seasons, and the kind of labor that left marks. James had found this house already standing when he arrived in Iron Creek Valley at 23, having bought the claim from a homesteader who'd given up after one particularly brutal winter. He'd spent the next 2 years rebuilding it almost entirely, new roof beams, new caulking, a kitchen addition that had leaned slightly to the east ever since and would never be persuaded to lean otherwise. He used to joke that the lean was the house expressing a preference. She had not been able to look at the eastern wall of the kitchen for 3 months after he died. Now she lay in his bed in his house and thought about timber and debt, and the strange mercy of needing too much to afford the luxury of grief. Survival had been the best and worst medicine. It had kept her moving, kept her from going under, and had cost her something she couldn't quite name. Some softness, some permission to be less than entirely capable. Ethan Cross had come riding out of a November storm and sat in her kitchen and been honest with her in a way that she hadn't realized she was starving for. Not kind, not careful, not wrapped in the protective softening that most people offered widows, as if the truth were something that needed to be broken gradually like bad news. Just honest. About the work needed, about Daniel's inadequacy, about his own reasons for being here when she'd pressed him. She didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't sure she needed to do anything with it yet, but she was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in the weather before it arrives, a difference in air pressure, a quality to the light. Outside, the temperature was still dropping. She could feel it in the way the house sounds changed when the cold got truly serious, the wood going tight as a drum. Before dawn, the thermometer by the barn door would read 20 below, maybe worse. The horses would need their blankets checked. The water troughs would need breaking before the morning feeding. She made the list in her mind the way she always did, methodical, sequential, the same litany she ran through every night as the last act before sleep. Tomorrow, timber survey, supply inventory fence check on the northwest corner that had been worrying her since the last storm. Tomorrow with Ethan. She closed her hand around the compass and let herself rest. They entered the north woods before dawn. The timber stood dark and enormous against the pale pre-dawn sky, the pines rising 60, 70 feet above the crusted snow, their lower branches stripped bare by winter winds, their upper canopies holding thick fans of needles that caught the cold air and held it. May had ridden this stretch of her property dozens of times without seeing it for what it was, had looked at the trees the way you look at a landmark rather than a resource, the way familiar things become invisible through repetition. But she saw them now. She saw them the way Ethan had described them, as money, as survival, as a fighting chance. Ethan walked the stand first, working methodically through the snow with a piece of charcoal in one hand, marking the trunks they'd take. He selected with care the straightest specimens, the ones with the fewest branch deformities, the kind of grain that would fetch the best price at a railroad camp that needed ties and structural lumber. He moved through the trees with the unhurried expertise of a man who had done this work before in other forests in other seasons, and May followed him and watched and began to understand that his skills were more varied than she had given him credit for. "We'll fell them away from each other," he said, gesturing at the spacing. "Take them in sequence so we're not fighting the direction of the fall." He touched the bark of a particularly straight trunk, a pine that rose 40 feet without a significant branch, its base 2 feet across. "This one first. It'll be the hardest. After this, you'll have the feel of it. Show me the position." He positioned her at the butt end of the two-man saw, demonstrating the angle of cut, the rhythm of the stroke. Push and pull. Let the blade do the work. Don't force it, because forcing wastes energy, and a blade that binds in frozen wood is a blade that breaks. The trick is patience, which is the trick in almost everything. The first tree took 3 hours. They pushed and pulled through frozen wood in the 10-degree air, and May's arms screamed and her back sent messages she chose to ignore. And her breath came in short, hard clouds that vanished at almost before they formed. But the rhythm took hold, eventually push and pull the saw's complaint, becoming a kind of music. And she lost herself in it the way you lose yourself in hard, repetitive work where the body takes over and the mind empties out into something clean and purposeful. When the tree finally groaned and cracked and fell, a sound like the world ending in slow motion, a thunderclap of impact and the cascade of snow from every nearby branch, something surged through her chest that she had no word for. Not quite triumph, not quite relief, something older and more physical than either of those. Ethan looked at her across the fallen tree and she looked back and they both started laughing at the same moment, the kind of laughter that comes out of exhaustion and achievement and the absurdity of two people in a frozen Wyoming forest celebrating having knocked over a tree. First one's always the best, he said when they'd recovered. Is that true? No, they're all good, but the first one you remember. They limbed it together and sectioned it with the buck saw and chained the lengths to Ethan's gray horse for dragging to the clearing by the creek. The work was slow and methodical and physical in the bone-deep way of winter labor, the kind of work that leaves no room in the body for anything but the next necessary motion. By sundown, they had felled 2 trees and stacked their sections in the clearing. 24 lengths of straight pine timber, each one representing a step between where she stood and the survival of everything she'd been fighting for. Raymond Cole is the man to see at the railroad camp, Ethan said, as they unsaddled the horses that evening, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. I've sold timber to him before. He's fair if you know your price is going in. Don't let him open the negotiation. How much should I expect? For what we cut today, about $15 if we get the right price. The full 2 or 3 acres. That's where it gets interesting. He looked at her steadily. Could be enough, May. It won't be easy or fast, but the math is there if we work for it. She absorbed this, ran it against the numbers in her head. We need $300. The bank won't accept partial. Then we cut $300 worth of timber. Before end of January. Then we start earlier tomorrow. She looked at him across the horse's broad back. You've done this before, not just cut timber this. Helped a ranch back from the edge. A few times. What happened to those other ranches? The question hung in the cold air between them. He finished with the horse and began on the gray, his hands working methodically. Different things, he said after a while. One made it. The owner's family is probably still there if the valley hasn't changed too much. A pause. One didn't. Drought took it the spring after I left. And one, he stopped. One what? I stayed too long at one. His voice was neutral in the careful way of neutrality that cost something. Got attached. Thought staying longer would help. Sometimes staying longer just makes the leaving harder. May understood without needing him to elaborate further. She understood it in the particular way of people who have their own versions of the same wound. But you left. I left. And you came here. And I came here. He looked up from the horse. Different this time, though. She didn't ask him to explain that. She wasn't ready for the explanation. They fell into the timber work the way they had fallen into all the ranch work completely, and without complaint, the days measured in the ring of axes and the groan of falling trees and the accumulation of stacked logs in the clearing by the frozen creek. The work was brutal in the particular way of December labor in Wyoming. Every tool handle cold as iron through the gloves, every motion requiring extra effort against the resistance of frozen wood and frozen ground, every evening's exhaustion, complete and bone deep. But the stack grew. 8 logs, then 16, then 24. Each one a small, concrete, undeniable argument against the bank's patience and Gordon Vance's expectation of her failure. On the 8th day, Ethan's axe slipped on frozen bark. It happened in an instant. The blade caught the lip of a knot and skidded sideways and bit deep into the pad of his left palm, and she saw the blood before she heard him make a sound. He made no sound. That was the thing that frightened her more than the blood, the absolute silence of it, the way he just stood and looked at his hand with the same deliberate calm he brought to everything else. Ethan. She was beside him before she consciously decided to move her hands already working. Let me see. It's not deep. It's deep enough. She was already unwrapping the red scarf from her neck, tearing it into a length of bandage with hands that would not quite hold steady. "We're going back. We've got 2 more trees marked. I don't care about the trees." The sharpness in her voice surprised both of them. She wrapped the cloth tight around his hand and held it looking up at him. "Don't argue with me." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise and something softer beneath it. He nodded. They walked back in silence, Ethan cradling his wrapped hand May, close enough to catch him if he stumbled on the uneven ground, though he showed no sign of needing it. In the kitchen, she sat him down and unwrapped the makeshift bandage with hands that were steadier now that the crisis had a specific manageable shape. The cut ran across the pad of his palm, deep and clean. Not life-threatening, but serious. She cleaned it with whiskey, which made him hiss between his teeth and look briefly away. Then she threaded a needle by the light of the kitchen lamp and stitched it closed with the practiced hands of a woman who had learned that after the James died, that the nearest doctor was a day's ride in good weather and considerably more in bad. "You're good at this," he said. He was watching her work with the particular focused attention he brought to everything, as if understanding how something was done was more important than the discomfort involved. "James taught me." She kept her eyes on the needle on the precise placement of each stitch. "He said a rancher's wife needed to know how to mend anything that broke. Fence animal or man." A pause. "He was right about most things." Most, she tied off the last stitch. He was wrong about how long he'd be here. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, and the kitchen went still around them in the way of spaces where something true has just been said. Ethan didn't try to answer it. He just sat with it, which was exactly the right response. "Keep it dry," she said, wrapping the wound in clean cloth. "No heavy work for at least a week." "A week. A week or it splits open and you're useless for a month." She tied off the bandage and finally looked up at him. "I need you healthy, Ethan. The timber can wait a few days." He looked at her for a moment. His expression had gone to something she hadn't quite seen on his face before. Open unguarded, the careful neutrality he usually maintained dropped like a coat in a warm room. "You were scared," he said, "when I got hurt." She didn't look away. "I was. For the labor." Not entirely for the labor. The admission sat between them in the lamplight, smaller and more consequential than the words themselves. His hand bandaged and still rested on the table between them. She could feel the warmth of it from where she sat. "I'm not going anywhere, May." His voice was low. "Not until spring at least. Maybe not even then." "Don't." The word came out too quick, too sharp. She pulled back from the table and busied herself clearing the medical supplies. "Don't make promises you can't know you'll keep. You told me yourself you have always left. When the season changes." "Maybe I'm tired of the season changing." He hadn't moved. "Maybe I'm tired of walking away from things that matter." She stood with her back to him, her hands still on the edge of the counter. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon had gone flat and gray, the kind of winter light that offered no comfort and no warmth, only the flat fact of the cold. "This isn't your fight," she said. "You keep saying that." His voice was even. "I keep failing to believe it." She turned, looked at him. He was still sitting at the table, his bandaged hand quiet on the surface in front of him, looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes that she was beginning to understand were not unreadable at all. She had simply been choosing not to read them. Before she could respond, the sound of horses reached them from the yard. She moved to the window and felt her stomach drop before she had consciously recognized the rider's Gordon Vance on his bay, flanked by the 2 ranch hands he always brought when he intended to be unpleasant. She had been waiting for this visit. She had not expected it quite this soon. "Go rest your hands," she said to Ethan. He was already standing. "I'll stay." She wanted to tell him not to. She wanted to walk out alone and deal with Gordon Vance the same way she had dealt with him the 2 previous times, with cold courtesy and a spine like iron, and the knowledge that she had nothing he wanted to give him. But the bandaged hand was Ethan's and the choice was his. She went to the door and opened it before Vance had finished dismounting. "Mrs. Harlow." Gordon Vance was a broad, heavy man in his late 50s, the kind of man who had spent more years receiving deference than earning it. He dismounted with the labored heaviness of that much authority in a cold climate and came toward the porch with the particular ease of someone accustomed to arriving in places and having people adjust to his presence. Cold afternoon for a visit. It is, May agreed. She stood with her arms at her sides and waited. Vance's eyes found Ethan in the doorway behind her. He took him in with a single assessing look, the look of a man accustomed to evaluating what a hired hand represented in the equation of a situation, and then returned his attention to her. I came to make you a proposition, Mrs. Harlow. His voice was warm in the calculated way of men who had learned to weaponize warmth. A fair one, a generous one, frankly, given your circumstances. I'm listening. This ranch is dying. You know it. I know it. The bank knows it. He let that sit for a moment. I'm prepared to buy your note, full amount clean transfer, and give you 6 months to make arrangements. You'd walk away free and clear with enough cash to start over somewhere more suited to your situation. This ranch is my situation, Mr. Vance. Now don't be rash. He held up a hand in the gesture of a man used to interrupting women and being thanked for it. I know what this land means to you. I know James built this place and it carries his memory. But memories don't keep cattle alive, and sentiment doesn't pay banknotes. His voice shifted, softened, became something May recognized as his most dangerous register. Marry me, May. Combine the properties, clear the debt. You'd have everything you need, security, resources, a real future. James would have wanted you taken care of. The silence on the porch was absolute for 3 full seconds. Then Ethan said from the doorway very quietly, "He's speaking for a dead man who can't contradict him. That's convenient." Vance's eyes cut to one. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Drifter." "You didn't get one," Ethan said. "You got a statement of fact." May felt something shift in her chest, something that might have been gratitude or might have been something more complicated than that. She stepped forward before either man could continue. "Mr. Vance," she said, and her voice came out exactly as she needed it to, even and final, and belonging to a woman who had already made up her mind long before this conversation started. "I'll say this once clearly. I'm not selling this ranch. I'm not marrying you. And I'm not interested in any arrangement that puts me in your debt or under your authority." She held his gaze without flinching. "I understand you're accustomed to getting what you want in this valley. I'm telling you that this is where that stops. Now it's cold, and I have work to do. Good day." Vance's face hardened in the way of men who have been refused things they consider already theirs. He held her gaze for a long moment as if expecting her to blink. She didn't. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," May said, "but it'll be my mistake." He turned and mounted his horse with the graceless dignity of a man performing the retreat he hadn't planned on, and rode away with his men, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded down the valley road and left only the wind. May stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then she exhaled. "You didn't need that," she said without turning. "My fight, remember." "I know." Ethan's voice came from just behind her left shoulder. "Close. I didn't fight anyone. I just said what was true." She turned and looked at him. The cold air between them was perfectly still. "He'll come back," she said. "Men like Vance don't accept no the first time. They rearrange the board and try again. Then we'll be here when he does." She studied him for a moment, the quiet certainty of his face, the way he stood on her porch like a man who had decided where he belonged and was not planning to reconsider, and felt the careful wall she maintained against exactly this feeling develop another crack. She went inside without responding, but she didn't tell him to go away. The next morning brought Frederick Hollis. He arrived at noon, thin and apologetic in his wool suit, clutching his leather satchel in the way of men delivering news they would genuinely prefer not to deliver. May had seen his face exactly twice before, once when she'd first negotiated the loan extension after James died, and once when the bank had sent the first late notice, and neither memory was pleasant. "Mrs. Harlow," he held up a hand before she could speak. "I want to say first that this isn't my doing, and I'm genuinely sorry for the difficulty." "What difficulty?" He opened the satchel and produced a set of papers. "Mr. Gordon Vance has made an offer to purchase your banknote. The transfer is legal and within the bank's policy." He set the papers on the kitchen table with the careful motions of a man handling something he wished didn't exist. "Once completed, Mr. Vance will own your debt and can demand full payment on his own timeline." May's vision went slightly white at the edges. "When?" "2 weeks. The transfer would finalize in 2 weeks, after which Mr. Vance could call the note whenever he chose. Hollis looked genuinely pained. I want you to understand that the bank is accepting because of your payment history, not because we want to see you lose the property. From a purely financial standpoint, a willing buyer at full value. How much time do I have before the transfer is final? 2 weeks, as I said. He paused. I truly am sorry, Mrs. Harlow. Thank you for coming to tell me personally, she said. The words came out with a mechanical politeness that had nothing to do with how she felt. I appreciate that you didn't just let me find out through the mail. After he left, she stood in the kitchen with the papers in her hands and let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly 30 seconds. The deliberateness of Vance's move, the elegance of it from his perspective. If he couldn't buy the land or marry the widow, he'd buy the debt and foreclose at his leisure. He would own her failure and could time it for maximum effect. Ethan came in from the yard and read the situation from her face before she said a word. He bought the note. Trying to, she put the papers on the table. 2 weeks. He looked at the papers for a long moment. Then we've got 30 logs stacked in the clearing. If we work every daylight hour for the next 12 days and get everything to Raymond Cole at the railroad camp, it won't be enough. She hated the flatness in her own voice, but had no energy to put color into it. Even if we clear the whole stand by the time we haul and sell at Cole's prices, we're maybe $60 short, and that's if nothing goes wrong. Then we make sure nothing goes wrong. She looked at him. He was standing on the other side of the kitchen table in the afternoon light, his bandaged hand at his side, his face carrying the expression she had come to know as his particular brand of stubbornness. Not the aggressive kind, not the kind that needed to shout, but the quiet, implacable kind that simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of giving up. You have no stake in this, she said again, but it came out with less conviction than before. She heard it herself. That's not how I see it. He came around the table and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. May, I know you're scared. I know what losing this place would mean, and I know you've been fighting it alone for 2 years, and I know that accepting help feels like admitting defeat. But it isn't, and I'm not temporary furniture you brought in for the winter and can put away in spring. His voice was low and steady. I'm here because this matters to me. You matter to me. Let me help. She looked at him for a long time in the silence of the kitchen, with the cold light coming through the frost-edged windows and the sound of the wind finding every gap in the old walls, and she felt the last organized resistance in her chest begin to loosen. All right, she said, we fight. Good. He didn't smile, but something shifted in his face. Then tell me where to start. She pulled the timber inventory from the table and spread it out between them, and they bent their heads together over the numbers, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor as they planned. And somewhere in the lean arithmetic of logs and prices and miles and days, something shifted between them that neither of them could have named precisely, but both of them felt with equal and unmistakable clarity. Not yet a declaration, not yet a beginning, but the decision made quietly and without fanfare to stop pretending there was nothing there to decide about. The timber days that followed were the hardest of May's life, and also somehow the most alive she had felt since James died. They worked from first light to last every day, and the stack in the clearing grew with painful slowness and then with the momentum of accumulated effort. 30 logs, 40-53. May's hands blistered and calloused and stopped hurting in the particular way of hands that have exceeded their limit and arrived somewhere beyond complaint. Her back sent up protests she overruled every morning. Her shoulder, weak since a fall 3 winters ago, delivered opinions she didn't have time to consider. But she also laughed more in those 12 days than she had in the previous 2 years. Not the polite social laughter of women being gracious in difficult circumstances, but genuine surprise laughter at Ethan's dry observations about difficult trees, at her own spectacular failure on the rope and pulley system they'd rigged to drag the heavier sections, at the absurdity of doing something this physically demanding, in conditions this cold for reasons, this precarious, and still being glad to be doing it. Tell me something, she said one evening, when they'd stumbled back to the house and were eating soup by the fire, too tired to sit up properly, sprawled in adjacent chairs like people whose bones had decided to take the night off. Why have you never married? He took a moment to answer in his way. Seemed unfair. To them, I mean. He looked at the fire. A man who can't stay isn't a man you should build a life with. It's not a fair trade. What changed? He looked at her. You mean in general? You said this was different this time. At the barn that night. She held his gaze. What's different? He was quiet for a long moment. The fire spoke in its crackling, domestic language. I stopped being afraid that wanting to stay meant I'd have to grieve it when I left. And now I think I'll grieve it either way. Might as well stay. The firelight moved across his face. She reached over and took his hand, the uninjured one, and held it, and neither of them made more of it than that, and it was exactly enough. They loaded the first haul at dawn on the 12th day. The night before, neither of them had slept well. Mei had lain awake running the numbers again, the same numbers she had run a dozen times over the past week, hoping they would add up differently if she arranged them in a new order. They didn't. They were what they were, 53 logs stacked in the clearing, an estimated price range she'd worked out in conversation with Ethan based on what he knew of Raymond Cole's buying habits, and the railroad camp's current needs, and a gap that was either manageable or catastrophic, depending on factors she couldn't control. She heard Ethan moving in the kitchen. Before 4 in the morning, the careful sounds of a man who was awake and didn't want to disturb her. She came downstairs to find coffee made and the stove built up, and Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with the timber inventory spread before him, making the same calculations she'd been making in the dark upstairs. He looked up when she appeared. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she poured herself coffee and sat across from him, and they went over the numbers together one final time, and by the time the sky outside the east window had gone from black to deep gray, they had their plan as solid as they could make it. 12 logs on the first load, the maximum the horses could haul 20 miles through winter terrain without breaking down. They would go together. Mei had argued for this and won on the grounds that she knew the road better, and that if something went wrong on the trail, one person alone was not a solution. The trail north to the railroad camp was a road in the generous sense, only 2 frozen ruts, through increasingly rough terrain, rising and falling over the broken country between Iron Creek Valley and the mountains. In summer, it was a hard day's work. In December, with 53 logs worth of ambition behind you and 2 overloaded horses, it was something else entirely. They set out as the light turned gray and the temperature sat at 15 below zero. Pepper moved steadily despite the cold, her breath making heavy white plumes that vanished almost before they formed. Ethan's gray pulled the loaded sled with patient digging strength, the chains taut and creaking, the sled runners throwing up twin fans of icy powder at every turn. Mei rode ahead, reading the trail for the obstacles that would cause them trouble. The narrow crossing above Miller's Creek, where the ice was thinnest at the edges, the long uphill grade before the basin, that would exhaust the horses if they weren't rested properly, halfway up the sharp left turn at the dead cottonwood that caught the sled's rear corner every time, if you didn't account for it. She had made this trip before with timber, a smaller load, a single horse, a simpler calculation, and the knowledge sat in her body more than in her memory. The first real problem came at Miller's Creek. The ice had softened on the downstream side of the crossing. Warm springs fed the creek at an underwater source, and in certain temperatures the ice grew thin unpredictably over the spring site. Mei had known about it and had intended to cross upstream of the usual ford, but the drifts had pushed the sled track closer to the bank than she'd planned, and before she could redirect them, Gray put a rear foot through the surface ice, and the back corner of the sled dropped 6 inches into the creek. The horse lunged forward instinctively, which made it worse. The sled shifted sideways, and 3 of the top logs shifted with it, and Mei was off Pepper and into the knee-deep water at the sled's corner before she had time to register that she was doing it. The cold was instant and absolute, a physical shock that drove the breath from her body. But her hands found the chain, and she braced, and the sled stopped moving. Ethan was already at the gray's head, talking the horse calm with his low, steady voice, keeping it from lunging again while Mei held the chain. The whole situation, horse, sled, woman in creek water, 12 logs contemplating a different route, balanced on about 15 seconds of very careful management. "Hold him," she said through locked teeth. "I have him. Can you get the chain onto the fixed point?" "Working on it." Her fingers were going numb. She could feel the water pulling at her boots, cold and deliberate, already working through the leather. The chain had to go on the rear sled ring, the fixed point that would let Ethan pull forward without losing the load. Sinu. She found it by feel, hooked the chain with hands she couldn't entirely feel, and said, Now, slowly, he moved the gray forward with the careful, graduated pressure of a horseman who understood momentum, and the sled came up out of the soft ice with a sucking, protesting groan, and the logs settled back where they'd been, and May climbed out of the creek and stood on the bank, dripping and shaking and counting her fingers. All present. "You're soaked," Ethan said, already moving toward her. "I noticed." She looked down at herself. Her lower legs were wet to the knee and would be frozen solid in 20 minutes if she didn't address it. "Give me the spare blanket from your saddlebag. May, we need to keep moving." She took the blanket from him and wrapped it around her legs and mounted Pepper with the mechanical efficiency of someone operating past the point of comfort into pure function. "We'll stop and dry out at the camp when we get there. If we stop now, the horses get cold and the logs get complicated. Give me 15 minutes and I'll be all right." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained several things she didn't have time to examine. Then he remounted and they moved on. She was in fact all right. 15 minutes of riding and the blanket and the body heat generated by moving through the cold air had taken the worst edge off the wet. Her boots would be a problem for days, frozen leather cracked, and these were the good boots, the ones she'd had, resoled twice and intended to keep for another 5 years. But that was a problem for later. The railroad camp appeared in the early afternoon, its collection of rough wooden structures and canvas tents, sprawling along the newly graded rail line in the gray winter light. The sound of construction reached them half a mile out, hammers and axes, and the deep groan of timber being maneuvered into place, and May felt the specific anxiety of a person approaching a negotiation with everything to lose. Raymond Cole ran the camp supply operation from a low wooden building at the north end of the site, and he was exactly what Ethan had described, a grizzled, capable man with the permanently squinting eyes of someone who had spent decades making rapid calculations about physical things. He looked at their timber with the expressionless thoroughness of a professional. "Good pine," he said, running his hand along a log. "Straight grain, minimal defect. Small load, though." He named a price that was 30% below what May had calculated as fair. She looked at him steadily. "Those logs are worth more than that, and you know it, Mr. Cole. I know what your camp needs, and I know what you're paying the outfitter in Rawlings for inferior stock." She had done her research, had sent a letter to a rancher 2 valleys over who'd sold timber to the camp the previous season and asked what price he'd gotten. "I'll take $80 for this load." Cole's eyebrows rose. He looked at Ethan, who said nothing, and looked back at him with the particular blankness of a man who had no intention of helping either side. Then Cole looked at May again, and she saw in his face the moment he recalibrated, not a widow hauling wood out of desperation, but a woman who knew exactly what she had and what it was worth. "75, he said, "because I need it, and you saved me the transport." "78, and I have more coming." A pause. "How much more?" "40 logs by the end of the week if you want them." Another pause longer. "78 now, 75 on the next load. I'll take everything you've cut." She shook his hand without letting him see her exhale. They unloaded in the cold and started back before the light failed the horses, moving more easily without the weight. May sat the saddle with the deliberate posture of a woman who was not going to let her frozen feet and aching back in the enormity of what remained to be done interfere with the 12 miles between her and home. "You were right about knowing your price," Ethan said, after they'd been riding for a while. "James taught me that too." She kept her eyes on the trail. "He said the only way a small operator survives against bigger ones is by knowing the value of what they have down to the penny. If you apologize for your price, you'll always get less than you deserve." He was a smart man. He was. A pause. The trail wound through a stand of bare aspens, their white trunks ghostly in the fading light. "I miss him every day. But it's different now than it was. The first year missing him felt like bleeding. Like the loss was constant and active, and something I had to manage every moment." She watched the aspens pass. "Now it's more like a scar. It's there. It'll always be there, but it doesn't run my life anymore." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing." "No." She looked across at him at his profile against the winter sky. "No, it isn't." They rode the last miles in a companionable silence that contained more than silence usually does, and the lights of the ranch came into view in the early dark like a thing that had been waiting for them, patient in particular. And Mei Harlow felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely recall that she was approaching home rather than returning to a place where she happened to live. The distinction mattered. She filed it away alongside the compass in the frozen creek, in the way Ethan had held the gray steady while she worked in the water, and tried not to think too hard about what all of it was adding up to. She thought about it anyway. The second load went out 3 days later, and the third 2 days after that, and each time the miles between the ranch and the railroad camp wore a little smoother into May's body, the way any repeated path eventually becomes less like effort and more like memory. Will and Clara Briggs came by on the morning of the third haul. Clara arrived first on foot carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth and wearing the expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something and was not in the mood for arguments. Will followed 10 minutes later on horseback, dismounting, with the measured unhurry of a man who intended to be useful and knew it. "Heard you've been running timber," Will said, coming to where May and Ethan were loading the sled. He looked at the stacked logs with the appraising eye of a man who'd done his own share of hard winter work. "You've got 2 horses and 2 people and 40 logs still to move." 37, Ethan corrected. "Still." Will put his hands on one of the logs. "You need wagons. I've got 2 and 4 draft horses. James is 16 and strong." He meant his oldest son. "We can start today." May looked at him. The offer was so plainly practically stated that it bypassed every reflex she had toward polite refusal. "Will, it's 12 days before Christmas." "Then we'd better get started." He turned and raised his voice toward the tree line where his son James had been sitting on his horse watching. "Come on then, work to do." Clara appeared at May's elbow. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't try to talk yourself out of accepting help on a technicality." Clara pressed her hands around the basket. "Fresh bread and apple butter. You can fight me on it later. Right now, you've got timber to move." Something loosened in May's chest, something that had been held tight for so long that it didn't know how to release all at once, but managed a portion. "Thank you, Clara." "Don't thank me. Just get those horses moving." With 2 wagons and 5 people, May, Ethan, Will, young James, and Clara, who refused to be left behind what would have taken May and Ethan another week, was compressed into 3 driving days. Will's draft horses were built for exactly this kind of load-hauling, broad-backed, and patient, and James Briggs proved to be exactly what his father had described, 16 strong as a post and possessed of the wordless work ethic that characterized the Briggs family generally. They cleared the stand on the 4th day. May stood at the edge of the cut clearing and looked at the stumps and the tramped snow and the sky suddenly visible above where the pines had been, and felt a complicated emotion that she didn't try to sort out: grief for the trees which had been beautiful in their way, satisfaction at what they had represented, and a kind of wonder that she had done it at all, that any of them had. "Last load goes tomorrow," Ethan said, coming to stand beside her. "I know." She looked at the stumps. "We'll replant someday, when things are different." "Apple trees," he said, "or cherry. Takes years, but they last." She looked at him. He was looking at the clearing with an expression she'd learned to read as forward-looking, not at what was but at what could be. It was a look she'd fallen into the habit of watching for. "You've been thinking about the long term, haven't you?" She had. She had been thinking about the long term in the late night hours when she should have been sleeping, lying in James's bed, with the compass on the table and the sound of the house settling around her, and the particular quiet of a person who has stopped dreading the future and started cautiously to wonder about it. She had been thinking about orchards and expanded pasture, and the garden plots near the creek, and what it would look like in 5 years if nothing else went catastrophically wrong. She had been thinking about it with Ethan in the picture. She hadn't told him that yet. "Yes," she said, "I have." He nodded, and they walked back to where Will and James were loading the last of the branches for firewood, and May did not say anything else about the long term, but she carried the conversation with her for the rest of the day, like something she intended to return to. The final haul to Raymond Cole's camp went without incident. Cole counted the logs, consulted his ledger, and produced a payment that, combined with the previous receipts, brought the total to $312. May stood in the camp office with the money in her hands and felt the specific quality of a number that had previously existed only as an abstraction. The abstraction of survival of barely enough become a physical and specific thing. "Pleasure doing business," Cole said. He paused. You've got more land north of the cut. I do. Good timberland if you're inclined to replant. He said it with the casual expertise of a man who had seen a lot of land and knew what it was worth. Railroad's going to need supply for another 3-4 years on this section. If you replant those acres in fast-growing species, you'd have a recurring operation. She hadn't thought of it in those terms. She held the image for a moment, the cleared acres replanted growing toward a future sale, while the orchard went in alongside and saw the ranch she wanted rather than the ranch she was barely keeping. I'll think on it, she said. You do that. And they rode home in the late afternoon with the money divided between them for safety, half in May's coat and half in Ethan's. And the coal was the same coal it had always been, and the miles were the same miles, but something about the return felt different. Lighter in the way that the removal of a specific dread is lighter even when plenty of other trouble remains. We have $312, May said as they crested the last rise before the valley. We need $300. We have $12 left over. A fortune, Ethan said, and there was dry warmth in his voice that made her want to smile. It really is, she said. Right now, it really is. But when they reached the ranch, the night's relief lasted only until the next morning, when Tommy Briggs appeared at the door with the expression of a child carrying news he didn't want to be the one carrying. Pa told me to come tell you, the boy said, twisting his hat in his hands. Mister, Vance was in town yesterday, telling everyone you're selling, that it's already decided that he has the note and you've agreed. Tommy looked up at her with his serious young face. Ma said it wasn't right him telling people things that aren't true. The anger came up clean and cold. Thank your mother for me, Tommy, and your father. After the boy left, she explained to Ethan what it meant Vance was creating a fait accompli. If he could convince the town that the sale was settled, then when he forced the foreclosure and the land went to auction, the only bidders would be ones who assumed the deck was already stacked. No competition, minimum bid. He's trying to make the outcome inevitable, she said, so that even if I fight it, it looks like I'm delaying rather than winning. Then we make payment before he expects it. Ethan was already thinking, don't wait for the deadline. Show up at his door with the full amount with witnesses and make it impossible for him to maneuver. He bought the note 2 days ago. If we pay him now, then it's done. The debt's cleared, the note's satisfied, and he can tell whatever story he wants to an empty audience. He looked at her steadily. But May, $312 covers the note. It doesn't cover what comes next. The cattle need feed. You're low on seed stock. The barn still needs proper. I know. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the money which she'd laid out in neat rows the night before for the pleasure of seeing it all together. I know what it doesn't cover. A pause. Daniel wrote to me last week. Ethan went still. I know, he mentioned he might. He offered capital, an investment partnership. She watched his face. You knew about that. He mentioned it was a possibility. I didn't tell him to, well, I know you didn't. She looked at the money. He's offering a 10% stake in exchange for operating capital, enough to see us properly through spring. She paused. 3 months ago, I would have refused without reading the second paragraph. And now she thought about everything Clara had said about communities holding each other up, about the 14 men at Raymond Cole's camp who'd unloaded her timber without comment and treated her as a professional, about Will Briggs showing up with wagons and his son and not asking for anything in return, about Ethan, who had ridden into her life on a gray horse and never once made her feel that needing help was the same as being weak. Now, I think pride is a useful thing in small amounts and a poison in large ones, she said. And I think refusing good help for bad reasons is just stubbornness with a nicer name. Something moved in Ethan's expression, something warm, and she thought a little relieved. I want to write to Daniel tonight, she said. Will you help me with the letter? Of course. They wrote it together at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, the winter dark pressing at the windows. She wrote the first draft, and he read it and suggested a single change, the addition of a clear statement of terms, specific and legally binding, so that the partnership was unambiguous, and she rewrote it, and it was better. It was 3 pages when they were done, professional and direct and honest in the way that May had come to value, above almost every other quality, the way 2 years of hard survival had taught her that honesty was the only currency that couldn't be devalued. You're good at this, Ethan said, looking at the finished letter. James used to say I should have been a lawyer. She folded the pages. He meant it as a compliment. My uncle thought it was an insult. Your uncle was wrong. She sealed the letter and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. 3 pages to Daniel Harlow in San Francisco, containing a business proposal, and beneath the business language, an acknowledgement that family meant something, even after the person who had connected them was gone, that the living had an obligation to the future that transcended the particular grief of the past. Tomorrow we go to Vance, she said. Tomorrow we go to Vance, Ethan agreed. She was about to stand when he reached across the table and took her hand. She looked down at his hand, covering hers, the scar across his palm, healed now to a pale line, and then looked up at his face. I want to say something, he said, before tomorrow changes things one way or another. All right. I came here for a reason I didn't fully understand when I arrived. His thumb moved across her knuckles, the same slow circles she'd first noticed weeks ago at the medical table when she'd been stitching his hand closed and trying very hard not to think about what she was feeling. I told myself it was the work. Then I told myself it was the principle of the things someone needed help and I could give it. He held her gaze. Both of those were true, but neither of them is the whole truth. She waited. The whole truth is that I walked into this ranch and watched you fight for something that mattered, and I haven't been able to think about leaving since the first week. His voice was low and even, the way he said everything, but beneath the evenness was something she'd never heard in it before, something unguarded and certain and a little afraid. I know you're not ready for declarations. I know you're carrying James, and I'd never ask you to put that down. But I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Vance does, and whatever the bank decides, and whatever Daniel writes back, I'm here. Not because I have nowhere else to be, because I want to be here, with you. The lamp flame moved in a draft from the window. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that remade the world in the morning. May turned her hand over so it was palm up and held his properly. I know, she said quietly. I've known for a while, I just wasn't ready to say it back. You don't have to say anything. I want to. She looked at him. I'm scared, Ethan. I won't pretend I'm not. I lost James and it nearly unmade me. The idea of, she stopped, started again. The idea of caring that much about someone again and losing them, that's terrifying. I know. But I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. She held his hand. I'm more afraid of getting to the end of my life and realizing I chose loneliness over love because I was too cautious to risk the second one. She paused. So there it is. The silence between them was warm in the way of silences that don't need filling. Then Ethan brought her hand up and held it against his jaw for a moment, a gesture so simply human and honest that it bypassed every defense she'd constructed, and she felt the careful structure she'd built around her heart not shatter exactly but open. Like a door long kept closed by someone who'd finally accepted that the room behind it was still worth entering. She leaned forward across the corner of the kitchen table and kissed him. It wasn't desperate or hurried. It was deliberate and warm, and tasted of coffee and something undefinable that was simply him. And when they separated, she felt the particular lightness of someone who has put down a weight so gradually that they forgot it was there until it was gone. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. She went to bed and for the first time in 2 years fell asleep quickly. Gordon Vance's ranch sat 4 miles east of May's, sheltered in a fold of the valley that kept it from the worst of the north wind. It was a prosperous place, large, well-maintained, with the slightly ostentatious order of a man who used his property as evidence of his standing. The main house had 2 stories and glass in all the windows. The barn could hold 40 horses. Everything about it announced that Gordon Vance had won his particular version of the war that everyone in Iron Creek Valley was fighting, and had won it decisively and a long time ago. May rode in with Ethan at her left side and Will Briggs, who had insisted on coming as witness, at her right. She had dressed with care that morning, the good coat, the boots that Clara had oiled for her 2 days ago, her hair pinned back properly. Not because she was trying to impress Vance, but because she understood that how you arrived at a confrontation told the other person what kind of confrontation it was going to be. Vance met them in his yard with 2 of his men and a lawyer he'd brought from town, a thin man in a brown suit whom she didn't recognize. He took in the 3 riders with a calculating look. Mrs. Harlow, His voice was pleasant in the specific way of a man who believed he had already won. "I wasn't expecting you." "I have payment," she said. She produced the envelope from her coat. "Full settlement of the note you purchased. $300 exactly in cash. Mr. Briggs is here to witness the transaction." Vance didn't move. "Payment isn't due yet." "No, but I'm making it anyway." She held the envelope out. "Take it, or I'll make the formal tender in front of your lawyer and your men and file a record with the county." Vance's expression shifted. The pleasantness went out of it like a candle being snuffed. He looked at his lawyer, who stepped forward with the particular expression of a professional who had been asked to confirm an unwelcome fact and was going to do it correctly regardless. "If full payment is tendered on the note," the lawyer said quietly to Vance, "the note is satisfied. You'd have no basis to call it." A long silence. Vance looked from the lawyer to the envelope to May's face. She looked back at him with the expression she had worn on the porch when he'd proposed marriage, and throughout the years of his circling pressure, the expression of a woman who had made her decision before she arrived and had no interest in reopening the discussion. Vance took the envelope. He opened it with deliberate care and counted the bills with deliberate care, as if hoping to find them short, as if hoping for some arithmetic error that would save him the indignity of what was happening. There was none. "Satisfied," his lawyer said, and began writing the receipt. When it was done, signed and witnessed, and folded into May's coat pocket alongside the compass, Vance looked at her with a face that had abandoned all pretense of warmth and become simply cold and hard. "You got lucky," he said. "No," May said. "I worked." She turned her horse and rode home, and the receipt sat over her heart, and the morning air tasted like the specific variety of freedom that can only be earned the hard way. The relief lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of sleeping without the weight of imminent catastrophe crushing her chest. 3 days of waking beside Ethan and believing cautiously and then with increasing confidence that the worst was behind them. 3 days before the cattle told her otherwise. She saw it first on a Tuesday morning, the particular way the heifers were standing at the trough, necks extended aggressive, in their hunger showing ribs that had not been showing 2 weeks ago when the feedstock had seemed adequate. She went to the hay barn and made herself do the count she'd been avoiding, because she already knew in her bones what the count would say. 2.5 weeks of hay remained. 3 if she rationed so aggressively the animals lost condition. After that, the herd would begin to fail. Every cent they'd scraped together had gone to Vance. The timber money, the reserve she'd held back from every egg sale and small transaction over the past 6 months, even the $20 she'd intended for spring seed, all of it gone into the note, which was satisfied and settled and legally unimpeachable, and had left the ranch technically saved and practically broke. She stood in the hay barn for a long time in the cold, counting bales she'd already counted. "How bad?" Ethan asked. He'd come in quietly as she hadn't heard him, and was standing in the barn door with his hands in his coat pockets in the particular expression he wore when he already knew the answer and was giving her time to say it. 2.5 weeks. She didn't turn around. Maybe 3. "And we have nothing to buy more with. Not enough anyway." She turned then. "We have $12, Ethan. $12 and 12 head of cattle. Feed runs out by the end of January." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the bales. "We could sell a few head now, get cash for feed, keep the rest alive." "Sell to who?" "Vance is the only buyer with ready money in this valley right now, and you know what price he'd offer a woman who just humiliated him in front of his own lawyer." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and didn't try to soften it. "He'd lowball us so badly we'd end up with enough feed for 3 weeks and no herd to speak of." "There has to be another way." "I know. I'm trying to think of it." She spent that night doing the same calculations she'd done before the timber operation, turning every possible option over and examining its underside. The results were worse than before because before she'd had the timber as a hidden resource, something unspent and waiting. Now that card had been played. What remained? The chickens, which were producing steadily, but not at a scale that could generate the $120 she needed for adequate winter feed. The egg money bought groceries and small supplies, not bales by the ton. The ranch itself, which she could not sell pieces of without losing the operating scale that made it viable. And Daniel's letter still pending, offering capital she hadn't yet responded to. She was staring at the ceiling, considering this when she heard the knock. It was barely 7 in the morning. She'd been awake since 5, and the sound of the knock in the gray pre-dawn had the particular quality of news that wouldn't wait for a reasonable hour. She pulled on her coat and went downstairs. Clara Briggs stood on the porch with a small leather pouch in her hands and an expression May recognized as the look of a woman who had made up her mind and was braced for an argument. "Come in," May said before Clara could speak. "Coffee's on." Inside, Clara sat at the table and set the pouch between them and said, "I want you to hear me out before you say anything." "All right, this is $200. Clara touched the pouch. "My savings, money my mother left me that I've kept separate for 20 years. She looked at May steadily. "I'm not giving it to you. I'm investing it. You take this buy feed, keep your cattle alive until the spring market. When you sell, you pay me back at 20% interest." "Clara, I said hear me out." Clara's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it's too much risk for me. You're going to say the cattle might not survive, the market might be bad, something might happen. And you'd be right that any of those things could happen." She folded her hands on the table. "But I watched you haul timber 20 miles in December. I watched you face Gordon Vance in his own yard with nothing but $12 and a receipt. I've been watching you fight for this ranch for 2 years. May, and I'm telling you, betting on you is the best investment I can make." The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. "What if I fail?" May said. "What if the cattle die or the prices crash and I can't pay you back?" "That's your mother's money, Clara. It's everything. If you fail, I'll grieve the money and be proud I trusted you anyway." Clara looked at her. "But I don't think you'll fail. And there's a difference between taking a risk and being a fool, and I know which one this is." She pushed the pouch across the table. "Take the money, buy the feed, give yourself a fighting chance. That's all anyone ever gets." May looked at the pouch. She thought about what Ethan had said, that refusing good help for bad reasons was just stubbornness with a nicer name. She thought about the timber days and the Briggs family showing up with wagons and Will's son James and Clara's fresh bread. She thought about what it meant to be held up by people who chose to hold you. She reached across the table and took the pouch. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate. She let them be inadequate because there weren't better ones. Clara's expression softened into something that was not quite a smile, but served the same function. "Don't thank me. Just don't let Vance have the last word in this valley." "I won't." Clara stood and collected her coat. "Will's going to wonder why I'm in such a good mood when I get home. Tell him you made a good investment." "Tell him myself." Clara paused at the door. "He'd want to come help load the feed. I'll send him over." After she left, May sat at the table with $200 in a leather pouch and felt the particular emotion of being trusted by someone who had every reason not to be. Not pity, not charity, investment. The word mattered. Clara had not come to offer a handout. She had come to put her money on a horse she believed in. May went upstairs and changed into her good coat and came back down. Ethan was in the kitchen, now coffee in hand, reading her face. Something happened. Something good. She picked up the pouch and held it out for him to see. "We're going to be all right." They rode to town that morning and bought feed bales of hay and sacks of grain in quantities that made the feed store owner look at her twice, because the last time she'd bought feed, she'd been counting out coins. She paid in cash and watched the wagon load up and drove it back to the ranch with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been underwater and just broken the surface. The cattle recovered quickly. Within 3 days, the change was visible. The aggressive hunger at the troughs eased, the ribs softened under their winter coats. The general restlessness that had attended the herd for the past 2 weeks settled into the calmer rhythms of animals that were adequately cared for. It was in the scale of ranch victories a small thing, but after the month they'd had it felt enormous. In the evenings, with the crisis of feed addressed and the debt settled and the winter slowly turning its face toward the possibility of spring, May and Ethan sat by the fire and talked about the future in a way she hadn't allowed herself for 2 years. Not cautious future talk, not the provisional planning of someone who expected the floor to give way, but real planning with the assumption that they would be here for it. "Daniel's letter," Ethan said one evening. He was mending tack by the fire, his hands moving with the automatic confidence of long practice, and May was writing in the ledger and thinking about spring. I wrote him back the night we had the conversation about partnership. She set down her pen. I told him I'd consider a 10% stake. His capital, my decisions. Any major financial change requires agreement from both of us, but day-to-day operations are mine entirely. She looked at the fire. I haven't heard back yet. You will. I think so too. She paused. It would change things, having real capital behind the operation rather than surviving season to season. A pause. It scares me a little. Good change can be scary too. You sound like a man who's been thinking about change himself. He looked up from the tack. The fire moved light across his face. I've been thinking about what permanent looks like, he said. What it would mean to have a name on a deed. A place that's mine in the actual legal sense, not just the sense of working for it. He held her gaze. With someone. She put the ledger aside. That's a significant thought for a man who called himself a drifter 4 months ago. I haven't called myself that in a while. Something in his voice was careful and honest in the way she'd come to recognize as his most serious register, the register reserved for things he decided to say rather than letting them stay unsaid. May, I'm not going to be 25 again and suddenly unscarred and easier to build a life with. I'm 41 years old. I own a horse and a saddle and not much else, and I have the working habits of a man who expected to be alone indefinitely. He set down the tack. What I'm offering is not a simple proposition. I know, she said. What I'm also offering, he continued, is a man who will be here every morning, working his end of whatever needs working, not because he has nowhere else to be, and not because it's the right thing to do, but because he stopped, she waited. Because nowhere else I've ever been has felt like this, he said, like I'm in the right place, like the particular shape of my life fits somewhere specific. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside a horse stamped in blue in the cold. James used to say that the ranch was a living thing, May said quietly, that it had a character you had to understand before it would trust you. That it took years of specific, attentive work before a place like this would give you anything back. He was right. You've been here 4 months. She looked at him. But I think you understand it already. I think you understood it faster than James did, and he was born to this country. I understand it because I was looking for it. He held her gaze. You don't find something you are not looking for, even when you don't know you're looking. She stood up from the table and crossed to the fireplace and sat down beside him on the bench close enough that their arms touched. He didn't move away. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the fire. Stay, she said, not as a question, as a statement. Stay here, build this with me. Yes, he said, simply and immediately without any of the careful preliminary qualifications she'd half expected. Just yes, the way he'd said yes to helping with the cattle that first evening, certain of what was needed and already moving towards it. They sat together by the fire while the night deepened and the cold worked at the corners of the house and the iron of the stove ticked and settled, and Mei Harlow held on to the warmth of a person who had chosen to be here and let herself imagine the shape of the spring. But imagining wasn't the same as planning, and planning wasn't the same as doing. And by the time the first gray light of morning came through the kitchen window, May was already at the table with the ledger open, and the spring planting schedule spread beside it, running numbers she had not allowed herself to run before now because running them required believing she'd still be here to act on them. The numbers were not comfortable, they never were, but they were workable in a different way than workable had meant before. Before workable had meant surviving the next crisis with enough pieces still standing to face the one after it. Now workable meant something more like planning, actual planning, with the assumption of continuity. She heard Ethan's boots on the stairs and looked up. You didn't sleep, he said. It was not a question. I was thinking about spring. She turned the ledger to show him. If Daniel's capital arrives when he promised, and if the cattle market holds where Raymond Cole says it's running, and if we sell 8 head in March, she pointed to the figures, we can buy seed stock for potatoes and carrots, expand the chicken operation by 30 birds, and still have enough in reserve for one genuine emergency. He looked at the ledger for a moment, then poured himself coffee and sat across from her. He studied the numbers with the careful attention he brought to practical problems, not trying to find fault, not trying to reassure, just genuinely reading what was there. You're conservative on the beef price, he said. Intentionally, Raymond Cole mentioned the camp needs beef in spring. If we can sell direct to the camp rather than through the valley market, we'd get. She did the calculation beside his finger. Maybe $30 more on the 8 head. Then the reserve is $60 bigger, which means the emergency buffer is actually meaningful instead of notional. She leaned back. We'd still be thin. One bad storm, one animal lost, one equipment failure. That's what the reserve is for. I know. She looked at the ledger. I've been running these numbers for 2 years expecting the next crisis to be the one that finishes it. It's strange to run them expecting. She stopped. Expecting to succeed. Expecting to be here next year doing this again. She looked up at him. It's an unfamiliar feeling. He looked at her with the steady dark eyes she'd spent 4 months learning to read. Get used to it, he said quietly. She got used to it. The weeks between New Year and the first true thaw were the most productive of May's Wyoming winters. Not because the work was easier, it wasn't, and the cold didn't relent until late February, but because she was doing it with the forward-facing attention of someone building rather than merely holding on. Every task she completed was no longer a crisis averted, but a foundation laid. She wrote twice more to Daniel Harlow in San Francisco, once to confirm the partnership terms, and once to send him the first accounting ledger entry made under the new arrangement, as clean and precise as anything the bank had ever received from her. He wrote back promptly, both times. His letters were still formal, still carried the careful register of a man who was uncertain how much familiarity was welcome, but they were consistent and attentive, and he never missed a commitment he'd made. In February, she paid Clara Briggs back in full, $240 the principal, plus the agreed interest, and watched Clara count it with the expression of a woman who had expected to be paid and is nonetheless slightly moved by the fact of it. I told you, Clara said. You did. May folded the receipt and tucked it in her coat. You were right. I usually am, Clara poured tea. Will says I'm not, but I am. She set a cup in front of May. What are you planning for spring? May told her. The full plan, the garden plots, the expanded chickens, the cattle increase, the fruit tree planting on the cleared northern acres. As she described it, she heard herself sounding like a person with a farm rather than a person fighting to keep one, and the difference was not small. Clara listened with her hands around her teacup, and her expression gradually shifting from attentive to something that May could only call proud, the kind of pride a woman feels for another woman who has done something genuinely difficult and come through the other side of it, changed for the better, rather than merely surviving. James would be proud, Clara said when May finished. That's what Ethan says. Ethan's right. A pause. He's good for you. May looked at her tea. I know. Does he know that you know? She thought about the night by the fire and the compass given as a gift, and yes, said immediately and simply, he knows. Good. Clara refilled the teacup. Then the only thing left to do is the easy part. May looked up. What's the easy part? Clara smiled. Everything else. Dear, Christmas arrived the way it had always arrived in Iron Creek Valley, without announcement, without ceremony, on a clear and brutally cold morning that made the sky look like blue glass. May had been awake since before dawn, not from anxiety, but from something she hadn't felt on a December morning in 2 years' anticipation. She lay in the gray pre-dawn dark and listened to the ranch settling around her, the familiar creaks, the distant sound of cattle moving in the near pasture, the wind finding the gap along the north window that she'd been meaning to recaulk since September. And she thought about Christmas the way you think about something you'd stopped believing in and had recently found again, like a coin in a coat you hadn't worn since last winter. When she came downstairs, she found the kitchen empty but warm, the stove already going coffee made. A pine bough on the kitchen table propped in a mason jar with water, its needles still dusted with the snow that had fallen overnight. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Ethan came in from the barn 10 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been raised to respect other people's floors. He looked at her, looking at the pine bough, and said nothing, which was exactly right. Where did you find it? She asked. East side of Miller's Creek, the only pine we didn't take. He poured himself coffee. It's not much. It's exactly right. She reached out and touched one of the branches, the resilient bend of it, the cold smell of pine resin on her fingers. James used to bring in a whole tree. The first year, we couldn't afford decorations, and we didn't have any, so we strung popcorn instead. She smiled at the memory, and the smile was clean rather than painful. It took us 3 hours, and the dog ate most of it, but it was beautiful. Dogs have good taste. She laughed, the surprised, genuine kind. It still caught her off guard, sometimes laughing freely, like a muscle that had been disused and was remembering its function. He really did. They ate breakfast in the Christmas morning quiet, and then Ethan produced a small cloth-wrapped bundle from his coat pocket and set it on the table between them. I didn't have money for anything elaborate, he said. The matter-of-fact plainness with which he said it was characteristic of him. He was not a man who apologized for his circumstances, which was something she found she admired more the longer she knew him. She unwrapped it carefully. The cloth fell away to reveal a small brass compass, old and well-worn, its face engraved with fine lines that had been rubbed smooth in places by decades of handling. She turned it in her fingers and watched the needle settle. North. Steady and true regardless of how she turned it. My father's, Ethan said quietly, the only thing I kept when he died. I've carried it for 25 years. He looked at her. He used to say a compass doesn't just show direction. It reminds you that being lost is temporary, that if you hold still and trust the instrument, you'll find your way. She looked up from the compass and at him. The morning light lay across his weathered face in a way that made him look like something carved from the country itself, permanent and functional and in its own way beautiful. I already have a compass, she said softly. James gave me one. I know. He held her gaze. Two doesn't hurt. She set them side by side on the table, the two compasses both pointing north, needles aligned. And she understood what he was saying without either of them needing to say it in words, that what had come before and what was here now were not in competition. That direction could be given more than once. That north was north regardless of who showed you. She reached across the table and took his hand. She had nothing to give him in return except what she'd already given herself. Her ranch, her carefully rationed trust, and the look on his face when she held his hand told her he understood that and considered it more than enough. The Briggs family arrived at mid-morning, their wagon loaded with covered dishes, and all three children barely containing their excitement about something May couldn't tell what, until Clara climbed down from the wagon and produced a bottle of elderberry wine she'd been saving since August, and young James Briggs produced a fiddle that turned out not to be decorative. My boy's been practicing, Will said with the specific pride of a father who knows the performance will be imperfect and doesn't care in the slightest. James demonstrated immediately. He was earnest, loud, and occasionally in the right key. He was also 16 and willing, and in May's kitchen on Christmas morning, with Clara's pie on the table and Ethan laughing at something Will had said, the music was exactly what was needed. Tommy Briggs tugged at May's sleeve after dinner, his face serious in the way of children who have prepared something and are nervous about delivering it. He produced a small, carved horse from his coat pocket, crude but unmistakably a horse with 4 legs and a mane, and the general earnest intention of a boy who had worked on something for 3 weeks. I made it for you, he said. Pa says you're going to be all right. I thought maybe a lucky charm would help. May took the small, carved horse and turned it over in her hands, feeling the roughness of the work and the completeness of the care behind it. She knelt down to Tommy's level. Your father's right, she said, and this is a very fine horse. Tommy stood straight to him. He's supposed to look like Pepper, or what Pepper looked like. A pause delicate. Before. She felt the tightness in her throat but kept it from reaching her face. He looks exactly like her. That evening, after the Briggs family had gone home in their wagon with the fiddle playing faintly until the sound faded down the valley road, May stood at the kitchen window with the 2 compasses in her hands and watched the last of the Christmas light go out of the sky. Ethan came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. Good day, he said. Very good day. She leaned back slightly against him. I'd forgotten what that felt like. A good day. An actual one. There'll be more. I'm starting to believe that. He pressed his cheek briefly against the top of her head, a small warm gesture entirely without performance, and she closed her eyes and held both compasses and believed it. Then 3 days after Christmas, disaster arrived in the form of a horse's scream. May heard it from the barn, a sound unlike any of the ranch's familiar vocabulary, high and continuous and wrong in the particular way that wild animal terror is wrong, sharp enough to send her running from the feed shed before she had consciously decided to move. Pepper was down in the near pasture. The Mustang mare had been May's horse since the second year of her marriage, a 3-year-old they'd bought at a summer sale because she was inexpensive and difficult, and James had thought May could handle her, which turned out to be correct in ways neither of them had anticipated. Pepper had carried May through 2 winters of widowhood without complaint, through storms and predators, and the kind of terrain that made lesser horses refuse and had been the single steadiest constant of the past 2 years of May's solitary life. She was lying on her side in the snow, and the angle of her right foreleg was wrong in the way that could not be made right. May reached her and dropped to her knees in the snow, her hands moving automatically, checking the neck pulse, looking at the eye, speaking the low reflexive sounds that didn't mean anything and meant everything. The human voice is animal medicine. Pepper's eye found her, white at the rim, rolling with pain, but it found her. Easy, girl, easy. Ethan came up beside her and crouched and looked at the leg with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had seen enough to know what he was seeing. His face said what she already knew. Compound fracture, he said. The bones I can see. And her voice was flat. The flatness was the only thing she had left right now. Everything beneath it was very loud and very terrible, and she was not going to let it out in the pasture in the cold. How did it happen? Ground gave under the snow crust near the fence corner. She came down hard. May looked at the leg. Then she looked at Pepper's face. The mare was past fighting it, just lying still, her breath coming in the fast, shallow rhythm of extreme pain, her eye fixed on May with the particular quality of an animal that had decided to trust the human it knew best and was doing it as a final act of faith. I'll do it, May said. Ethan stood. You don't have, she's mine. She stood too. Her voice was still flat. Give me a minute. She went to the house and got the rifle and loaded it with hands that she refused to let shake and came back out across the snow that had killed her horse. She knelt beside Pepper one more time, put her hand on the mare's neck and felt the warmth of her. You carried me through the worst of it, she said quietly. You did more than you were asked, and you did it every time. You were a good horse. She positioned the rifle. She looked into Pepper's eye one last time. The shot was clean and instantaneous, and the sound of it echoed across the frozen valley and came back diminished from the hills. Ethan held her while she cried. She allowed herself the grief, the specific and enormous grief of losing an animal who had been in the 2 years since James died, one of the few consistent sources of warmth in her world. She cried until she had nothing left to cry with, and Ethan held her through all of it without speaking, because there was nothing useful to say. The work doesn't stop, she said finally, her voice ragged and stripped. No, he agreed, it doesn't. I'm down to 1 horse. We'll use the gray for the heavy work. Borrow from Will when we need more. It's workable. She pulled back and wiped her face. The cold had dried the tears almost before they fell. I'm tired of workable. I want things to be good, Ethan. Not survivable. Not barely. Good. He looked at her. They will be. You keep saying that because I keep believing it. He held her gaze. And because I've been watching you fight for 6 weeks and I know what you're capable of. The horse is a loss, a real one. But you're still here. The ranch is still here. We're still here. He touched her face briefly with one gloved hand. That's not nothing. She looked at him for a long moment in the pasture where Pepper lay still. No, she said at last. It's not nothing. They buried the mare that afternoon in the frozen ground behind the barn, brutally hard work, the earth resisting every stroke of the pickaxe, and both of them sweating despite the cold. Ethan carved a simple marker from a piece of scrap board, Pepper good and faithful. They stood together in the fading light and said nothing because nothing was needed. That night, May took the compass to bed with her both compasses, one in each hand, and lay in the dark listening to the house and thinking about the shape of grief. How it never went away entirely, only changed its form. How loss accumulated in layers, and each new loss found the old ones and stirred them so that grieving Pepper was in some complicated way grieving James again too. and grieving the girl she'd been before she understood how loss worked, and how, in the midst of that grief, there was something else now. Something steady and warm in the room below her, a presence she had begun to rely on the way you rely on a fixed star, not desperately, not with the clinging hunger of someone who has too little, but with the quiet gratitude of someone who had found a reliable thing in an unreliable world. She held the compasses and pointed herself north. January arrived with the news May had been waiting for. Daniel Harlow's letter came on a Tuesday, carried by the same territorial mail rider who had brought so much difficult correspondence over the past 2 years and was for once bringing something different. May sat at the kitchen table with Ethan across from her and read the letter twice before she said anything. Daniel had agreed to her terms. 10% operating capital of $500, all major financial decisions by mutual agreement, day-to-day authority, entirely hers. The money would arrive by wire transfer within the week. There was a personal note at the bottom, handwritten and careful, unlike the formal typed letters he'd sent in the months after James's death. I know I should have come when Thomas died. I know a letter isn't sufficient. I'm sorry. This is the best I can do from here. Let me do it properly. She set the letter down. He used James's real name, she said. In the family, everyone called him Thomas. She paused. I thought that was interesting. Ethan waited. He's not wrong, she said quietly. A letter isn't sufficient. But she picked it up again and looked at the handwritten note. He wrote this himself. He didn't have his secretary do it. It means something. She set it down again. I'm going to accept. Good. You were right about the difference between pride and isolation. I know. He said it without smugness, which was the only way it could have been said without her wanting to argue with it. I was also right, she added, about needing to do this on my terms. You were absolutely right about that. She looked at him across the table. Are we both always going to be right? Probably not. The corner of his mouth moved. But we'll take turns. She wrote back to Daniel that afternoon a brief professional acceptance of the terms as written, and a personal line at the bottom that matched his indirectness. Thank you for coming through when it mattered. That counts for more than you know. When the wire arrived the following Wednesday, May stood at the bank window and watched the clerk count out $500 and felt something she had almost stopped believing in abundance. Not great wealth, not ease, but the specific and transformative sensation of having enough. Enough to repair the barn properly. Enough to buy seed stock for spring planting. Enough to hire Daniel, the young man she'd been eyeing from town 18, and willing and in need of steady work to help with the spring operation. She walked out of the bank into the January cold with $500 in her coat and the receipt from Vance in her other pocket and the compass over her heart, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk of Iron Creek Valley's main street and breathed. Ethan was waiting with the horses outside the feed store. He watched her cross the street and read her face the way he'd learned to read it. How does it feel, he asked. Like spring, she said. It feels like spring, even though it's January and 20 degrees and nothing has changed yet. Everything's changed, he said. The ground just hasn't caught up. She mounted up and they rode home together through the cold afternoon, and Iron Creek Valley stretched around them, white and vast and brutal, and if you knew how to look at it, beautiful, and the compass pointed north. And Mei Harlow looked at the road ahead and felt for the first time in 2 years like she was going somewhere rather than simply surviving where she was. The young man she hired was named Daniel Garrick, no relation to Daniel Harlow, which produced a brief moment of confusion when she mentioned it, and he arrived with a bedroll and a willingness that reminded her of Tommy Briggs at twice his age. He was 18, the second son of a farmer, 2 valleys over, and he knew horses and basic carpentry and very little else, but he applied himself with the focused intensity of a young man who understood that this job was an opportunity. Ethan trained him with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, and within 2 weeks Daniel Garrick was handling the morning feeding and the livestock rounds without supervision, which freed May and Ethan to turn their attention to the barn repair and the spring planting that had been waiting since November. The barn repair took 6 days. They worked with lumber purchased from the next valley sawmill, a modest but adequate haul that Ethan loaded and transported with Daniel's help, while May calculated the spring planting schedule. When the repairs were done, the barn was solid in a way it hadn't been since before James's illness. The roof properly framed and shingled, The north wall re-chinked against the wind, the stall dividers sound rather than merely standing. May walked through it on a February evening when the work was finished and the light was going gold through the new shingles and felt the particular satisfaction of something restored rather than merely preserved. He would have liked this, she said. Ethan, who had been checking the stall latches, looked up. James, he built the original barn in his second winter here. He told me about it, how he was so proud of it, and it was not actually a very good barn, but he'd done it himself, and that felt like proof of something. She ran her hand along a repaired post. He kept improving it every year, was always going to replace the roof properly. Just never quite got to it before she stopped. Now it's done, Ethan said simply. Now it's done. She turned to look at him in the barn light. This man who had picked up the unfinished work of a man he'd never met and done it with as much care as if it were his own. And she understood something she hadn't had words for until that moment, that loving this ranch meant honoring what James had started, and Ethan had been doing that from the first day without being asked. She went to him and kissed him in the repaired barn in the February light, and he held her with the arms of a man who was not going anywhere, and the wood around them smelled of fresh lumber and old memory, and the particular good smell of work completed. They were in the feed barn 2 weeks later when she heard a wagon coming up the road, a different sound than usual. Heavier and more deliberate, the sound of a vehicle that carried something official. She came out into the yard to find a wagon with 2 men in wool coats and felt hats, the kind of men whose clothing announced a professional function without specifying it. Mrs. Harlow, the older one, climbed down, consulting a folded paper. My name is Richard Hayes. This is my associate, William Grant. We represent the Wyoming Central Railroad. The words landed with unexpected weight. May kept her expression neutral. We're conducting advanced surveys for a route expansion through this section of the valley. Hayes continued. We're authorized to discuss acquisition of land in the corridor for right-of-way and station facilities. He unfolded the paper, a map, and showed her a line marked in red pencil that ran directly through the northern portion of her property. Your land appears to intersect with our preferred route, Mrs. Harlow. We'd like to make you an offer. May looked at the map. The red line ran precisely through the 40 acres she'd clear-cut for timber. The bare land, the stumps, the section she'd already been thinking about replanting. What are you offering? She said. Hayes named a figure, $1,100 for the full property. She almost laughed. I'm not selling my whole ranch to the railroad, Mr. Hayes. Your route requires right-of-way through my northern acreage, not the whole property. She handed the map back to him. The timber acres, 40 acres already cleared, running along the northern border. Your red line goes through that land. She looked at him. I'll sell you the 40 acres for $450. A silence. Mrs. Harlow, Grant said carefully, the standard acquisition price is what I'll get for 40 acres of cleared land in an exact corridor location, which saves your surveying team 6 months and avoids any need for eminent domain proceedings. She said it pleasantly but precisely. 450, and I want it in writing that the railroad acquires no rights to my remaining property now or in the future. Hayes and Grant exchanged the look of men recalibrating. She recognized it. She'd seen it on Raymond Cole's face at the railroad camp. We'll need to survey and confirm, Hayes said. Of course. I'll have coffee ready when you're done. They surveyed the northern 40 acres that afternoon and came back to the kitchen table to negotiate for approximately 20 minutes before arriving at $425, which was closer to what she'd asked than what they'd offered and would satisfy her purposes. She shook Hayes's hand and showed them out and closed the kitchen door and stood with her back against it for a moment. Ethan was at the table watching her. $425, she said. I heard. A pause. What are you thinking? She came to the table and sat down across from him and pulled out the ledger and began to write. I'm thinking about replanting the northern section. Not pine, the railroad will want the right-of-way cleared anyway, but the surrounding acres. She wrote as she talked, the numbers taking shape under her pen. Fruit trees, apples, take 7 years to produce, but they'd be there in 7 years, he said, and the year after, and the year after that. Yes, she looked up. And with the railroad money plus what Daniel's sending, plus what the cattle will bring in spring. She did the calculation. We're solvent, actually solvent. Not barely, actually. The word felt strange and wonderful in her mouth, like a language she'd thought she'd forgotten. What does that look like? Ethan asked. It looks like spring planting without counting seeds. It looks like a hired hand we can actually pay. It looks like, she paused, looked at the ledger, looked at him. It looks like being able to think past next month. He was quiet for a moment. When did you decide about the replanting? Raymond Cole mentioned it at the camp. She looked at the map she'd kept, the railroad survey map with her 40 acres marked. He said the cleared land was prime for fast-growth species, that the camp would need supply for years. She turned the map over. I've been thinking about it since, about what this place looks like in 5 years. In 10. What does it look like? She looked across the table at him. In the afternoon light that came through the kitchen window, she could see the lines of his face clearly, the weathering of hard years, the quiet that had deepened over the months she'd known him into something that felt less like reserve and more like steadiness. The face of a man who had stopped moving and found that the stopping felt right. It looks like us, she said simply. The ranch and us, building something that will last the season. He held her gaze. That's what I want too. I know. She reached across the table. I've known for a while. He took her hand. They sat like that in the kitchen light, with the ledger open between them and the map of the railroad corridor, and the spring planting schedule, and the compass on the windowsill, and the world outside was still white and cold, and would be for another 2 months, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. That evening, May went to James's grave. She visited sometimes, not as often as she once had, not with the urgent, almost desperate need of the first year, but with the regular, quiet intention of a person maintaining a relationship that had changed form without ending. She went in the late afternoon when the light was going orange and the cold had a crystalline quality that made everything look precise. She cleared the snow from the wooden marker and stood beside it and said what she'd been working toward saying for several weeks. We're going to be all right, she said. I wanted you to know that. The ranch is going to be all right. A pause. I think you'd be glad about that, even if some of the choices I made to get here aren't the ones you'd have made. The railroad land, Daniel's partnership, letting people in. She touched the marker. You used to say that stubbornness was the only capital I had. I think you were mostly right. But I've learned that stubborn in the right direction means knowing when to accept help, not just when to refuse it. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods at the edge of the yard. I've met someone, she said. I think you'd like him. He knows how to work, and he tells the truth, and he's decided to stay. She paused. He's different from you. You were Fire James, bright and fast and absolutely certain. He's more like, she searched for the word, more like iron, steady, strong in the cold. She smiled slightly. I needed fire when I was young. I think I need iron now. She stood for another moment in the last of the afternoon light. Thank you, she said, for bringing me here, for building something worth fighting for being the kind of man who made me believe a place could be home. She pressed her hand once against the top of the marker. I love you. I'll love you until I'm buried here next to you. And I'm going to build something on this land that would make you proud. She walked back to the house. Ethan was standing in the kitchen doorway when she came across the yard, the lamp making a warm rectangle behind him. He didn't say anything when she reached the porch, just looked at her face and moved aside to let her in and handed her a cup of coffee without being asked. Good, he said. She thought about James's grave in the last orange light and the ranch that was no longer barely surviving and the spring that was 2 months away. Good, she said. March arrived the way it had always arrived in Iron Creek Valley, not with warmth, but with the specific quality of light that told you warmth was on its way. The sun hit differently in March, lower and longer, catching the south-facing slopes at an angle that turned the snow to water before noon and left the ground dark and steaming by afternoon. The cattle felt it. Their behavior changed from the quiet endurance of deep winter to a restlessness that said spring in a language older than words. May felt it too. She was in the garden plot near the creek on a clear March morning, turning the first soil she'd been able to work since October, when she heard a horse coming up the valley road. Not the familiar sound of Will Briggs or Cole's supply wagon or any of the other regular traffic of the neighboring ranches. Something different. Something that had traveled farther. She straightened up and shaded her eyes. The rider was well dressed in the manner of a city man who had tried to dress practically for a long ride and partially succeeded. Good coat, decent boots, a hat that was correct for the purpose, but sat on his head as though it was not entirely used to being there. He rode a bay gelding that had the look of a hired horse capable, but not distinguished. He reined up at the yard gate and looked around with the expression of a man checking what he'd found against what he'd been told to expect. "Mrs. Harlow?" She leaned the spade against the fence post and walked toward him. "That's right." He dismounted, and she saw his face properly mid-30s, fine-featured, with the quality of indoor living about his skin that confirmed what his clothing suggested. But his eyes were James's eyes, or near enough to James's that it hit her somewhere below the ribs before she could prepare for it. "I'm Daniel Harlow," he said, "James's brother." She looked at him for a moment. In 2.5 years, she had received 12 letters from this man, and not once a visit. She had composed in her head, and occasionally on paper, a number of responses to this hypothetical arrival ranging from cold courtesy to something considerably more direct. What came out was, "You're shorter than he was." Daniel Harlow blinked. Then unexpectedly, he laughed a startled, genuine sound that was also something like James's laugh, and the resemblance undid another piece of her prepared response. "Everyone says that." He sobered. "I should have come sooner. There's no adequate explanation for why I didn't. I know that." "Come inside," she said. "There's coffee." In the kitchen, with Ethan's measured presence at the table and Daniel sitting across from her, with his hat in his hands, she let him say what he'd clearly rehearsed on the ride north. He was sorry. He had been afraid and then busy, and then ashamed of having been afraid and busy, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to arrive. None of these were adequate reasons. He knew that. He was here now. She poured coffee and let him finish. "What made you come now?" she asked. He looked at his cup. "Your letters, the accounting ledger you sent." He paused. "You're not the woman James described, or rather, you're more than that. The letters you wrote about the partnership terms, the planting schedule, the negotiations with the railroad." He shook his head slightly. "James told me you were stubborn and capable. He undersold both." A pause. And then Ethan's letter. May looked at Ethan. "I wrote to him in January," Ethan said. His voice was even, but she heard something careful beneath it, the tone of a man who had made a decision he was prepared to defend. "I told him you were doing something extraordinary here, that if he intended to be your partner in the legal sense, he ought to understand what that meant in the real sense." He held her gaze. "I also told him there was a wedding to plan." The kitchen went still. May looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then she looked at Daniel Harlow, who was looking at the table with the expression of a man trying to be invisible in a conversation he understood was not entirely about him. "You told him there was a wedding," she said. "I did. Before you asked me. Before I asked you." A pause. "Well, though you did tell me to stay and build this with you, I considered that implicit." She looked at him. He looked back steadily with the particular quality of calm that was she had come to understand how he looked when he was most certain of something. She turned back to Daniel. "Was there a specific reason you came in person rather than simply writing back?" "I brought something." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, legal in its format, dense with fine print, and set it on the table. "The partnership agreement as we discussed, signed and witnessed." He paused. "And something else." He produced a second document, smaller, also signed. "The 10% stake I hold, transferred back to you in full." He pushed it across the table. "I don't want a percentage of this ranch, May. I want to be part of the family that owns it. That's a different thing." She picked up the transfer document and read it. The language was clear and legally precise. The 10% was hers, unencumbered, with no conditions and no repayment required. She set it down. "You didn't need to do this. James would have wanted you to own it free and clear." Daniel's voice was quiet. "He built it for you, not for a business arrangement." He looked at Ethan. "I understand there may be a different name on the deed before long. That seems right, too." May looked at the document. Then she looked at Ethan, at his steady face, his patient eyes, the particular quality of stillness that was not passivity, but the opposite of it, a person who had decided exactly where they stood, and was comfortable standing there for as long as required. "You really wrote to him," she said. "I did. Without asking me. I was fairly confident about your answer." She considered him for a long moment. "That was a presumptuous thing to do." "It was," he agreed. "I'd do it again." She was quiet for a while. The stove ticked. Outside through the kitchen window, the March light lay across the yard in the gold specific to late winter afternoons, when the season is turning and the world is suspended between what it was and what it's about to become. "All right," she said finally. "Yes." Ethan's expression didn't change much. He was not a man whose face announced things dramatically, but something in it settled the way a stone settles into the right place in a wall. Solid, final, correct. "Yes to what exactly?" Daniel Harlow asked carefully. May looked at him. For a moment she saw James in his face, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, and instead of pain she felt something she hadn't expected: gratitude. That some piece of James was still here in the Wyoming world, still part of whatever came next. "Yes to the wedding," she said. "Yes to your being here. Yes to all of it." She picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window at the greening world and felt the precise quality of a future that had, against considerable odds, and through the particular combination of stubbornness and help and honest work that she had learned to rely on, remained open. The ground was thawing, the cattle were restless, the cleared northern acres waited to be planted. Spring was coming to Iron Creek Valley, and Mei Harlow intended to be here for every year of it. They were married on a Thursday in June, not because Thursday was the most convenient day, or because June was the most romantic month, or because any of the usual reasons for choosing a time applied in the usual way. They were married on a Thursday in June because that was the day the traveling judge arrived in Iron Creek Valley on his circuit, and because by that point in the spring, May had decided that waiting for a more ceremonially appropriate moment was itself a kind of foolishness, the kind that let perfectly good days go by unexperienced because you were saving them for a better one that hadn't arrived yet. The judge was a small man named Riley, weathered and direct, who agreed to perform the ceremony for the price of a good dinner, which Clara Briggs insisted on preparing herself, which was how Clara came to be both the witness and the cook, managing both roles with the particular efficiency of a woman who had never once in her life done only one thing at a time. Will Briggs stood as the second witness. He arrived with his son James, who had brought his fiddle and had been practicing since March, and had improved considerably, though considerably was a relative term. Tommy Briggs, now 13, wore his good shirt and stood straight as a post and looked like a young man who understood that something important was happening and wanted to be equal to the occasion. Daniel Harlow had stayed. That was the thing May had not expected when he arrived in March, that he would still be there in June. He'd sent a letter to his business partner in San Francisco explaining an extended absence, and then another letter, and then it became clear that he was not in fact leaving. He gave no explicit explanation for this beyond the observation made once over breakfast in April that Iron Creek Valley was a more interesting place than he'd expected, and that his business partner was more capable than he'd been giving him credit for. He slept in the room off the kitchen that had been Ethan's through the winter, and he worked alongside Daniel Garrick on the spring planting with the earnest ineptitude of a man who had not done physical labor in a decade but was genuinely trying. And he and May developed over the course of those spring months something that was not quite the relationship she'd had with James, but was something real and familial and growing like the fruit trees she'd planted in the northern acres, which would take years to bear fruit, but were rooted now and were not going anywhere. The morning of the wedding was clear and warm. May woke early, as she always did, and lay for a few minutes in the particular quality of early summer light that came through her east window, different from winter light in every way, warm and long, and full of the specific generosity that short Wyoming summers have, as though the land is compensating in concentrated form for all the cold months that came before. She thought about James. She thought about him the way she had been thinking about him for months now, not with the acute disorganizing grief of the first year, and not with the careful management of the second year, but with something that had finally settled into its permanent shape. Love that had changed form without diminishing. Memory that hurt less and honored more. The particular quality of continuing to carry a person after they are gone, not as a burden, but as a weight that had become so familiar, you'd notice its absence more than its presence. She got up and dressed and went downstairs and found Daniel Harlow at the kitchen table with his inevitable coffee going over a letter from his partner in San Francisco. He looked up when she came in. "Good morning," he said, then looking at her face. "Good morning." "Say it again and I'll put you to work." He smiled, James's smile still catching her, occasionally still doing that thing below her ribs. "You look like her today." "Who?" "The woman James described in his letters." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He wrote about you, you know, after he brought you here. He said he'd married a woman who was smarter than him in every way that mattered, and that if she ever figured that out, he was in trouble." He paused. "I think he was very glad you figured it out." She sat down across from him. Outside, she could hear Ethan and Daniel Garrick in the barn, the familiar rhythm of morning chores. A sound she had come to know as completely as the sound of the house itself. "He never told me that," she said. "He was afraid of sounding besotted." Daniel set down his cup. "Which he was, completely and absolutely. He wrote pages about how capable you were. He was proud of you in a way that embarrassed him. I think men of his generation didn't always know how to say that simply." He looked at her steadily. "I wish I'd come when he died. I know an apology doesn't fix that. But I want you to know that when I came in March and saw what you'd built here, what you'd kept standing, I understood for the first time what he was describing in those letters. And I understood why he was so proud." May looked at her hands on the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "He would have liked Ethan," she said. "The two of them would have driven each other completely insane, and then they'd have gotten along extremely well." Daniel laughed James's laugh genuinely. James's laugh, and she held it for a moment like something precious before it faded. "Probably," he agreed. They sat together in the early morning kitchen while the coffee stayed warm and the sounds from the barn marked the day's beginning, and May felt the particular peace of a life that had arrived at a moment she could be fully present for, not braced against the next crisis, not moving through grief, not managing the distance between where she was and where she needed to get to. Simply here in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood and the first warmth of June, with the people she loved within earshot. Ethan came in from the barn at 7:30. He stamped his boots at the door out of habit and stood in the kitchen looking at May across the room, and she looked back at him, and the moment had the quality of a very long conversation that both of them already knew the content of. "Ready," he said. "Been ready since January," she said. He smiled, rare and specific and entirely for her, and poured himself coffee. The ceremony happened at 11 in the morning in the yard in front of the ranch house. Clara had hung a rope of wildflowers along the porch railing. She'd spent 2 hours the previous afternoon gathering them from the creek bank, and the June air carried the smell of new grass and turned earth and the particular clean warmth of a Wyoming summer morning, which was the smell of the valley's yearly redemption after everything winter had taken. Judge Riley stood with his back to the house and read from his battered legal notebook the words he said a dozen times a year in a dozen different places across the territory. They were not elaborate words. They were the plain, functional words of a legal contract, and May listened to them with the attention she had recently discovered she gave to all contracts carefully because the terms mattered. Will Briggs gave her away. He did it the way he did everything, without ceremony or self-consciousness. His grip on her arm firm, and his voice steady when he said the traditional words. And she was grateful for his matter-of-factness, which kept the moment from becoming more than she could hold. Clara cried. She had informed everyone beforehand that she would not cry, and was crying before the first paragraph was finished, and made no effort to conceal it. Tommy Briggs stood at attention with his jaw set and his eyes bright, looking like a young man determined to honor the occasion by being completely composed, which he was, except for the single moment when Ethan produced the ring. James's mother's ring, which May had worn on her right hand since the funeral, and had moved to her left that morning, and Tommy's composure wobbled slightly before recovering. Daniel Garrick, 18 years old and hired to help with the spring planting, stood at the back of the small gathering with his hat in his hands and looked like a young man who was moved by things and did not want to admit it. Daniel Harlow stood to the left of the group and watched with the expression of a man paying a debt he should have paid much earlier and finding the payment more rewarding than he deserved. Ethan stood in front of her and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since December, with the complete, unhurried attention of a person who is exactly where they intend to be. She said the words when they were asked for. So did he. Judge Riley said what judges say, and it was done. The fiddle started immediately. James Briggs had been waiting, hand on bow, ready for the signal, and the yard filled with the kind of music that is earnest and imperfect, and therefore exactly right for the occasion. And Clara produced a pie from somewhere that smelled of apples and cinnamon in the summer that was just beginning. And Will Briggs produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been carrying in his coat and poured it into cups that appeared from various directions. Daniel Harlow gave a toast that was brief and careful and contained a line she would remember. James would have chosen you for her if he'd known you. That's the highest thing I can say. Ethan inclined his head, once in acknowledgement, the same way he acknowledged everything important without performance, without excess, and May felt the compressed weight of everything that had brought them to this yard on this June morning and let it sit in her chest as the specific and irreducible thing it was. They danced in the afternoon, not elaborately, the fiddle, May and Ethan, the Briggs family, moving in and out, as the spirit took them, Tommy partnering May with the solemn ceremony of a boy who had determined to be a proper adult participant in a grown-up event. She danced with Daniel Harlow, who was a better dancer than she expected and looked slightly embarrassed by the fact. She danced with Will Briggs, who was not a good dancer and didn't care, and who said quietly near the end of the song, "He's a good man, May." "I know," she said. "Took me a couple of weeks to be sure, but he is." "He's patient with your fiddle player," she said, "which tells me everything I needed to know." Will laughed and the song ended, and she found Ethan at the edge of the yard standing where the cleared ground met the grass of the eastern pasture, watching the cattle in the late afternoon light. She came to stand beside him. The ranch spread before them. The pasture green was summer grass, the barn solid and repaired. The chicken coop expanded and noisy with 40 birds, the garden plots near the creek showing the first real growth of the season. The northern acres cleared and replanted with young apple trees that were 10 inches tall and would be 40 feet before either of them was old, standing in their first summer rows like the beginning of something. In the distance, just visible against the sky, the surveyor's stakes that marked the railroad right away through the 40 acres she'd sold. Progress and connection in the literal iron sense. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That it looks different from this side of it," he said. "Which side?" "The side where it's actually mine." He looked at her. "Where we're actually building something instead of working toward the possibility of edit." A pause. "I've never owned anything in my life, May. Not a plot of land, not a room, not a horse that wasn't borrowed or rented." He looked back at the ranch. "I don't know exactly how to do this." "I didn't either," she said. "I learned." "I know." He looked at her. "I've been watching you." She reached into her coat pocket, habit reflex, and her hand closed around the compass. She brought it out and held it in the summer air, and the needle swung and settled, pointing north the way it always pointed, true and patient, indifferent to season or circumstance. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "It was James's first," she said. "Then it was mine. It showed me which way was forward when I'd lost the ability to see it on my own." She pressed it into his hand. "Keep it." He closed his fingers around it. "You don't need it anymore." "I know the way now," she said simply. He looked at the compass in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at her. "North," he said, "always north." He put it in his shirt pocket over his heart, and she felt the rightness of that, the compass finding its place as things eventually found their places if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and honest enough to let them. That evening, when the Briggs family had gone home with their wagon and their fiddle and their leftover and Daniel Harlow had retired to his room, which had been Ethan's in the winters, and was simply Daniel's room now, the way the ranch had rearranged itself around its new inhabitants, without anyone formally deciding anything. May and Ethan sat on the porch in the warm June dark. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. The chickens had settled. Somewhere to the east, a coyote called once and was answered from the north. "Tell me something," Ethan said. "What something you want, not what you need, not what the ranch needs, what you want 5 years from now." She thought about it. Really thought, which was a luxury she'd been slowly learning to afford, the luxury of wanting things rather than simply requiring them. "Apple trees tall enough to give actual shade," she said. "A kitchen with a proper stove that doesn't run cool on the north burner. Enough hired help that I can choose not to work on a Sunday without the ranch falling apart." She paused. "Tommy Briggs coming back from wherever he goes when he grows up to visit And fine, we're still here. Another pause. You, still here, just that. Still here. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want, she asked. All of that, he said. And one more thing. What? To feel in 5 years the way I feel right now, like I'm in the right place, like the particular shape of my days fits exactly where I am. He looked at her. I've never had that before you. I don't want to lose it. She took his hand on the porch in the warm dark, and the stars came out one by one over Iron Creek Valley, and the ranch lay quiet around them. She thought about James the way she always thought about James, would always think about James, would carry him forward in the particular way of people who have been truly loved and can't forget it even when they've been truly loved again. She thought about the compass, which was now in the pocket over Ethan's heart. She thought about north, about the needle that pointed the same direction, no matter who held it, no matter what season, no matter what the weather was doing. Direction didn't change, only the person following it. She had followed it through grief and through stubborn surviving and through learning at considerable cost the difference between pride and strength. She had followed it through timber days and frozen creeks in the face of Gordon Vance, at the moment he understood she was not going to break. She had followed it through Clara's $200 and Daniel Harlow arriving on a March morning with his apology and his document and his face that looked like James. She had followed it here, this porch, this summer night, this man beside her who had ridden out of a November storm and simply refused to be temporary. The compass pointed north. It always would. She was not afraid of that anymore. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. It's nearly 10 o'clock. I know. She stood pulling him up with her, but I'm not ready for today to be over yet. He stood beside her in the warm doorway and looked back for a moment at the stars above Iron Creek Valley, and she looked with him, and then they went inside and closed the door on the summer dark and the sound of the coyotes and the extraordinary, ordinary quiet of a life that had, against considerable odds, found the shape it was always supposed to have. The lamp burned in the kitchen window long after the valley had gone to sleep. North, the compass said. Always north. Mei Harlow Cross was already there. In the weeks that followed the wedding, the ranch settled into its summer rhythms the way a river settles after spring flood. Not to stillness, which was never the point, but to a purposeful flow each day, moving in the right direction with something like authority. Daniel Garrick was a revelation. The boy had come in April as a pair of willing hands, and by July he was managing the morning livestock rounds without supervision and had developed under Ethan's patient instruction a competence with horses that bordered on genuine skill. He had also discovered, without anyone planning it, that he had a gift for chickens, for reading their behavior, for identifying the small signs of illness before they became large ones, for managing the flock dynamics that determine laying rates. May gave him authority over the chicken operation with a formality that made him stand slightly straighter and watched him take the responsibility seriously in the way of young people who have been trusted appropriately. He's going to be good, Ethan said one evening, watching Daniel Garrick move through the chicken coop with the sure, unhurried attention of the competent. He already is, May said. Better in a year. Much better in a year. She turned back to the kitchen garden where the potato plants were coming in thick along the creek bank. He needs a raise. He hasn't been here long enough for a raise. He's been here long enough to earn one. She looked at Ethan. James used to say the way you kept good people was to pay them before they started thinking about leaving. Not after. A pause. He said a lot of useful things. He did. She pulled a weed from between two potato plants. I didn't always listen properly the first time. I'm listening now. Daniel Harlow stayed through August. So, he had come intending to stay a week and was still there 3 months later, and if anyone thought this was strange, no one said so. He worked in the mornings, genuinely worked in the way of a man discovering that labor had rewards his office in San Francisco had never offered, and spent his afternoons reading and corresponding with his business partner, who had adapted to his absence with impressive efficiency. He and May ate dinner together on the evenings when Ethan was finishing late in the barn, and they talked about James with the specific care of two people who loved the same person and were still learning each other's version of him. He was afraid of heights, Daniel said one evening. This emerged with the quality of something long stored suddenly surfacing. May looked up. No, he wasn't. He absolutely was. He fell off the roof of our parents' house when we were boys, only about 8 feet, but he landed badly. After that, he couldn't go above the second rung of a ladder without his hands sweating. Daniel smiled at his plate. He would have been furious that I told you. May thought about all the times James had done work on the barn roof, the particular deliberate quality he'd brought to every movement up there. Not the confidence she'd always read it as, something more like courage. He never said anything, she said. No, he wouldn't. Daniel shook his head slightly. He was afraid of looking weak in front of you. He said you were the bravest person he'd ever met, and he didn't want you to think less of him. A pause, which is exactly the kind of thing that sounds absurd from the outside and makes complete sense when you understand how much he loved you. She sat with that for a long moment. James going up that ladder every time it needed climbing, his hands sweating and his jaw set, and his face carrying the deliberate calm she had always read as ease. He was braver than I knew, she said. You both were, Daniel said simply. He left in September on a clear morning with his horse rested and his coat brushed and a carry bag that was heavier than when he'd arrived because Clara Briggs had been quietly adding things to it for weeks. He said goodbye to Daniel Garrick and to Ethan with the brief, firm efficiency of a man who did not trust himself to be elaborate. He said goodbye to Clara with a longer embrace and to Will with a handshake that became a brief, gripping moment. Then he came to May. She was standing in the yard in the September morning with the particular light that September brought to Iron Creek Valley gold and long and slightly heavy, as though the sun understood it was nearly done for the year and was making the most of what remained. You'll come back, she said. At Christmas, he said, if that's all right. It's more than all right, he nodded. Then with the careful, deliberate manner of a man doing something he had been planning and was not going to let anxiety rush. He was right about you, May, everything he wrote. He paused. I'm glad I came. So am I. He mounted his horse and rode south out of the valley, and she watched until he was gone, and then she turned back to the ranch. Ethan was on the porch. He had been watching from there, giving them space as he always gave people space, and he handed her a cup of coffee when she reached him. He'll be back, he said. Christmas, he promised. He's a man who keeps his promises. Took him a while to figure that out, but he is. She sipped the coffee and looked at the empty road where Daniel had been. James would have liked this, she said. Not the way things went, not James dying and all that followed, but this part, the part where his brother comes back, the part where the ranch survives and grows. She looked at the apple trees on the northern slope, small and particular in the September light. He wanted this place to matter beyond him, to be something that lasted. It will be, Ethan said. It already is, she said. The fall harvest came in well. The potatoes and carrots from the creek garden filled the root cellar to a level May had not seen since James's last healthy year. The chickens, under Daniel Garrick's careful management, had produced consistently enough through summer to sell surplus at the Valley Market and the railroad camp both. The cattle, 15 head, now the strongest herd May had maintained since inheriting the operation, went to market in October and fetched a price that made Raymond Cole look at her with something approaching respect. She paid Clara Briggs an additional $20 beyond the agreed repayment, not as interest, but as acknowledgement, the kind that can't be transacted but can be gestured toward. Clara accepted it with the brisk practicality of a woman who understood what was being said and didn't need it said twice. She put money aside for spring, enough for seed, for equipment, maintenance, for the additional hands she intended to hire in planting season. Enough to feel, for the first time in her experience of this ranch, that she was managing from adequacy rather than scrambling from deficit. She also, on a cold October evening with Ethan across from her at the kitchen table and the ledger open between them, made a decision she had been working toward for months. I want to build a proper root cellar, she said. He looked up. The current one is too small and the drainage is wrong. If we build a proper one before winter, deeper, better insulated with a drainage channel, we could store 3 times as much through the cold months and reduce loss from freezing. She showed him the sketch she'd made. It would take 2 weeks with both of us and Daniel Garrick. And it would mean we go into next spring differently than we've gone into any spring I've had here. He studied the sketch with the attention he gave to all practical problems, thorough, specific, looking for what she might have missed. Foundation needs to be below the frost line, he said, which means 4 feet minimum. Maybe 5 on this north-facing slope. I factored that in. She pointed to the depth notation. Drainage channel should run south, not east. The creek floods east in spring melt. She looked at the sketch. He was right. I'll revise it. Other than that, he looked up. It's good. It's a good plan. Thank you. I mean it. It's the kind of thing you build when you're thinking 10 years ahead. She looked at him across the table. That's what I'm doing, she said, thinking 10 years ahead. All the time now. She held his gaze. It's very strange after the last 2 years, but it's good strange. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Good, he said. Stay that way. They built the root cellar in October, the three of them, with additional help from Will and James Briggs, on the digging days when the depth of the excavation required extra hands. It took 12 days rather than 14 because the ground was cooperative, and Daniel Garrick turned out to be better at masonry than anyone had expected, including himself. When it was done, May stood at the top of the stairs and looked down into the proper dark of a properly built cellar, cool and dry, and draining correctly with shelf space for the winter store, and felt the satisfaction of something built to last. Next summer, she said to Ethan, who was standing beside her, we fill it so full we can't close the door. That's the plan, he agreed. The first snow came in November. May woke to it, the particular silence of snowfall in the night, the muffled quality of a world that had changed while she slept, and lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn listening. Beside her, Ethan breathed steady and slow. The house held its warmth. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the yard, white and new, the fence post capped, and the barn roof smooth, and the apple trees on the northern slope standing in their rows with their branches beginning to catch snow. The compass was on the windowsill. It had lived there since she'd given it back to herself, or since Ethan had given it back to her, which was how she thought of it, because the gesture of giving it was inseparable from the gesture of receiving it. He'd set it on the windowsill one morning with no explanation, and she'd understood without one. She picked it up. The needle swung and settled. North. True north. Patient as iron, steady as the pole star it pointed toward. She had been lost once. Not lost the way you're lost in a forest with no landmarks and no trail, but lost the way you're lost when the future closes in front of you and the present becomes only the management of crisis, and the past becomes the only country that makes sense. She had been lost in grief and debt and stubborn isolation, and she had come out of it the way you come out of anything difficult, not all at once and not cleanly, and with the help of people who showed up whether you asked them to or not. Clara Briggs with her mother's savings and her matter-of-fact faith. Will Briggs with his wagons and his son and his simple understanding of what neighbors did. Tommy Briggs with his carved wooden horse which lived on the kitchen windowsill beside the compass. Raymond Cole, who had paid a fair price when pushed. Daniel Harlow, who had arrived 3 months too late and stayed 3 months longer than planned and left the ranch larger in ways that weren't only financial. And Ethan Cross, who had ridden out of a November storm on a gray horse and been exactly what she didn't know she was waiting for, not a rescuer, not a solution, but a partner in the actual and serious sense of the word. The kind of partner who didn't diminish you in the process of helping you. She looked at the snow on the yard and the apple trees and the roof of the root cellar and the barn that was solid, now properly solid, and she felt the weight of everything it had taken to get here. Every timber day, every frozen creek, every night she'd lain awake calculating impossible numbers, and she let herself feel it fully without rushing past it towards something less uncomfortable. It was worth every bit of it. Behind her, Ethan stirred. Snow, he said. First real one. A pause while he sat up. She heard him reach for his shirt. Cattle? I was about to go check. I'll come. She turned from the window. He was standing already half-dressed, his hair disheveled, and his face carrying the particular quality of the just woken that she had come to know intimately the few unguarded seconds before full consciousness, before the day's specific competence assembled itself. In those seconds, he looked younger and more simply human, and she loved him with a directness that no longer frightened her. Together then, she said. They went out into the first snow of winter together, as they had gone into the last snow of the previous winter together, May in her coat, Ethan in his, the cold hitting them at the door, and the white yards spreading before them, and the cattle lowing from the near pasture in their morning voices. The ranch received them. Iron Creek Valley lay under its first white blanket, and the mountains north were invisible in cloud, and the compass in May's pocket pointed north as it always had and always would steadily, without drama, the way true things pointed. She looked at Ethan in the cold morning light, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed saying, and they went to work. That was how it was. That was how it would be. The needle pointed north, and they followed it together into the white and particular morning toward whatever came next.